Dead America, Tales from the Outer Banks. Roanoke Island, by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Day 0. 7:07 a.m., Inglehart, North Carolina, 70 miles southwest of the Outer Banks. The dark blue sedan sat in the parking lot of the small rest area just off the highway. Inside, the 420-something friends were deep into their slumber. Nixon and Grant were in the front seat, resting their heads against their respective windows. In the back seat, Violet and Anna were laying side by side on the back seat. Nixon startled awake when a seagull landed on the hood and squawked loudly. His sudden movement caused his elbow to hit the horn, scaring everybody else awake. "Okay, I'm up." Grant looked around frantically, expecting something bad, but calmed down when he looked over and saw Nixon with a guilty look on his face. "Really, man? You're gonna honk the horn to wake us up?" "It wasn't my fault, Grant. Some damn bird yelled at me and my elbow hit the horn," Nixon protested, pointing to the seagull that was now strutting across the hood with an air of superiority. Grant glared at his friend for a moment before shaking his head. He heard the girls in the back stirring to life, moaning at their sudden wake-up call. "You really are a dick, Nixon," Violet groaned, her voice still thick with sleep. "Again, it wasn't my fault." "You're behind the wheel, so it is your fault," Anna mumbled as she rubbed her eyes. Nixon let out a defeated sigh, knowing that he wasn't going to win the argument. He tried to stretch but found his tall frame too cramped within the confines of the driver's seat. "What the hell time is it anyway?" Violet asked, pushing her tangled hair from her face. Nixon grabbed his phone from the cup holder, clicking the screen on. The digital numbers glowed in the dim morning light. "Just after 7. "Fantastic. Instead of watching the sunrise on the beach, we're starting our vacation in some small-ass town," Anna said, not bothering to hide her disappointment. "With no cell service," Grant added, holding his phone up against the window as if that might help. Everybody looked at their phones, seeing that they had 0 bars of service. A collective groan filled the car, the sound of 4 people realizing their social lifelines had been cut. Nixon opened his door, stepping out into the brisk morning air. The chill immediately cut through his thin t-shirt, causing him to shiver slightly. "Where are you going?" Grant asked, watching his friend with mild annoyance. "Just need to stretch for a minute before we start driving." Grant started to protest, but before he could, Nixon was to his feet, stretching the soreness out of his muscles. Nobody else got out, however, preferring the warmth of the car to the morning chill. "Come on, Nixon, if you're going to wake us up this early, at least drive us down the street to the gas station so we can get some coffee," Violet called from the back seat, her tone somewhere between pleading and demanding. Grant and Anna joined in with similar sentiments, everybody talking over one another, finally getting Nixon to relent under the pressure of their combined morning grumpiness. "Fine, we'll go get coffee," he said, throwing his hands up in surrender. Nixon popped his back one more time before climbing back into the car. He started it up, letting it idle for a second before popping it into gear. The engine coughed briefly before settling into a steady rumble. He drove back out to the highway that weaved its way through the small town. He turned onto the street, driving slowly down the road as they all took in their surroundings. Up ahead, they saw a handful of businesses lining the road, nothing open at this hour. Behind the businesses were rows of houses, but no signs of life. No cars, pedestrians, nothing. The morning fog hung low, giving the town an eerie, abandoned feel. "Gotta love that small town life. Everybody's sleeping in and taking it slow," Grant remarked, staring out at the silent storefronts. "Look around. There's like 300 people who live here. What else is there to do besides sleep in?" Violet said, her voice tinged with sarcasm. "Hey, I grew up in a town like this," Anna protested weakly. "So you know then," Violet replied with a smirk. Anna wanted to respond, but the fog in her brain from the lack of caffeine prevented her from formulating a witty comeback. Instead, she just slumped back against the seat, her eyes half closed. "Gas station up on the left," Nixon announced, breaking the brief silence. "Thank God. Let's hope it's open," Grant said, perking up at the prospect of caffeine. The group looked a few blocks up towards the station, spotting a couple of cars parked beside the pumps, but nobody by the cars. Nixon pulled in, driving around to one of the open pumps and parking. The lights inside were on, suggesting the place was open despite the early hour. Everybody piled out of the car, stretching and groaning as their few hours of sleep in the car had taken its toll on their muscles. After a few moments, everybody but Nixon walked towards the door. Nixon stayed behind to pump gas, removing the nozzle from its holder. "You want me to get you anything?" Grant asked, pausing at the entrance. "Yeah, large coffee, splash of cream, and none of that flavored crap if you can help it," Nixon replied as he inserted his credit card into the pump. Grant nodded as he joined the two girls, the trio moving quickly towards the door, eager to get inside and find a bathroom and caffeine. Not necessarily in that order. The welcome bell dinged as the door opened, Anna and Grant turning to head to the back of the store where the bathrooms were located. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unflattering glow on the aisles of snacks and sundries. "There better be multiple bathrooms or else you're going to have to wait," Anna said as they quickened their pace. "I'm not sure my bladder will let me," Grant replied, matching her stride. Anna and Grant's eyes met, both of them realizing the other wasn't bluffing, and they picked up the pace towards the rear of the store, their footsteps echoing in the quiet space. Violet shook her head as she walked over towards the coffee pots. She let out a sigh when she saw that one was empty and the other had been knocked over, spilling the contents onto the counter. The dark liquid had congealed around the edges of the puddle. "Come on, really?" she groaned, looking at the mess with disgust. Violet looked around for a clerk, but didn't see anyone. She called out into the store, hoping someone was within earshot, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Clean up on aisle 1, and you're out of coffee." Violet looked around, expecting someone to respond, but nobody did. With a sigh, she grabbed a bag of coffee and began prepping the machine herself, muttering under her breath. "Okay, I guess I'll do it myself then." After a few moments, she had the coffee brewing, the gurgling of the machine providing the only sound in the otherwise silent store. She walked up towards the front counter where they had a small hot bar filled with breakfast items. As she looked, Anna returned from the restroom, looking slightly more awake. "Where's the coffee?" Anna asked. "Brewing," Violet replied, nodding toward the machine. Anna looked around for help, but nobody was there. The store seemed completely abandoned despite being open with lights on. "Where'd the clerk go?" "Still haven't seen one," Violet said, a note of concern creeping into her voice. The two of them looked around, Violet's eye catching that some items on the checkout counter were knocked over. Candy bars and lighters were scattered across the surface, as if someone had swept their arm across in a hurry. A bout of unease hit her as she walked towards the register, Anna finally taking notice of her friend's cautious approach. "What are you doing?" Anna asked, staying by the coffee machine. Violet didn't respond, instead continuing to walk over cautiously. She looked over the counter as she got closer, letting out a gasp when she saw a large pool of blood on the ground. The crimson puddle had spread outward from behind the counter, dark at the edges where it had begun to dry. "What the hell?" Violet whispered, her hand instinctively covering her mouth. Anna rushed over, looking over and seeing the same thing. Her eyes widened in shock, and she immediately pulled out her phone and tried to call 911 but didn't have a signal. Her fingers trembled as she repeatedly tried to dial. "Damn it, I still don't have service," Anna said, panic rising in her voice. Violet looked out the window, past Nixon, who was still pumping gas. Across the street, between two buildings, she spotted someone walking with an uneven gait. The figure moved sluggishly, as if disoriented or injured. Violet darted out from the store, immediately yelling out towards the only person they've seen all day, waving her hands to get their attention. The cold morning air hit her face as she burst outside. "Hey you, across the street. Please, we need help." Nixon perked up at his friend yelling, confused by her sudden outburst. He turned around to spot the person she was yelling at, the gas nozzle still in his hand. As soon as the sound reached their ears, the figure across the street snapped its head around, focusing on Violet. They began sprinting towards them, rushing into the street without looking. Their movements were jerky but unnaturally fast. As they got halfway across the street, both Nixon and Violet realized something was wrong. The person's shirt was covered in blood, and the expression on their face didn't look right. Their eyes were vacant, mouth hanging open. Violet realized something was very wrong. "Nixon, look out!" Chapter 2. Nixon stared at the zombie racing towards him for several seconds before his mind clicked into gear, realizing he was in danger. He left the nozzle in the car, backing up to put a little more distance between him and the sprinting ghoul. A moment later, the creature closed the distance, darting around the back end of the car and reaching for the young man, its fingers stretched outward, grasping at the air inches from Nixon's chest. Nixon continued to backpedal, relieved when the zombie tripped over the gas nozzle, falling flat on its face on the pavement, its nose cracking audibly. The sound of bone breaking against concrete made Nixon wince instinctively. Rather than writhe in pain, the creature moaned excitedly, scrambling to its feet to continue the pursuit. Dark blood poured from its shattered nose, but it showed no signs of discomfort as it regained its footing with unnerving speed. "Get your ass over here, Nixon!" Violet screamed from the doorway of the convenience store, her eyes wide with terror. The young man didn't have to be told twice, turning and sprinting towards the entrance of the convenience store. The creature was in close pursuit, only a couple yards behind him. Nixon could hear the thing's ragged breathing and the slap of its shoes against the pavement as it gave chase. All the commotion in the parking lot drew both Anna and Grant into the doorway of the building, looking at their friend being chased. "What the hell is going on?" Anna asked, her voice rising in pitch as she spotted the bloody figure closing in on Nixon. "Get back inside," Violet shouted, pushing past her friends. The terror in Violet's voice snapped Anna and Grant to attention, as she was one who never panicked. Both of them darted back in the store, clearing the way for Violet and Nixon. Violet went through the door, grabbing it and holding it open for Nixon, who was barely ahead of the rushing zombie. As soon as he crossed the threshold, she tried to slam the door shut. However, the creature was too quick. The zombie plowed through the door, sending it back into Violet's face, bloodying her nose. She stumbled backward, hand flying up to her face as warm blood trickled down her lips. The creature reached out for Nixon, who turned and put his hands into the zombie's chest, giving him a better look at the ghoul. The man, formerly middle-aged, snapped its teeth at him, drooling blood. Small chunks of flesh and hair caught in its teeth. His shirt was stained red, but there was no visible wound. The creature's eyes were vacant, yet somehow focused intently on Nixon. "Help me!" Nixon shouted, straining to keep the snapping jaws away from his face. Grant pushed by Anna, getting behind the zombie and wrapping his arms around its midsection, pulling back. Between him pulling and Nixon pushing, they managed to put a little distance between them. The creature thrashed wildly, its strength seemingly undiminished despite being restrained. The creature's arms flailed about, trying at first to grab Nixon again, but then focusing its attention on Grant, reaching down to grasp at his arms. Its fingers clawed at Grant's wrists, scratching his skin. Nixon noticed and smacked at the creature before managing to grab its wrists. The ghoul's arms were unnaturally stiff, the muscles tense and rigid beneath Nixon's grip. "What do we do?" Grant asked, his voice strained from the effort of holding the thrashing creature. "I don't know," Nixon replied, panic evident in his voice as sweat beaded on his forehead. Nixon looked the creature in the darkened eyes, speaking forcefully. "All right, buddy, you need to calm down." The creature didn't react, only continued to flail about, jaws snapping at the air between them. "That was your plan?" Grant shouted, incredulous. Nixon shook his head, looking around for an idea. Before he could think of one, Violet yelled out from the back of the store, "Bring him back here." Both men looked to Violet, who was standing beside the walk-in freezer, which she had open. Cold air billowed out around her as she held the heavy door. Both of them reacted on instinct, moving as one as they dragged the zombie to the back of the store. They paused at the threshold of the freezer, nodding to each other, their breath visible in the cold air. "On 3. 1, 2, 3, Nixon counted. They shoved the creature into the freezer with enough force that it fell to the ground. Before it could get back to its feet, Violet slammed the door shut, grabbing a metal hook from a nearby display, sliding it into the locking mechanism. The four of them stared at the freezer door for a moment as the creature thrashed about inside of it. The door shuddered with every smack, but it held. Thuds and scratches echoed from within, the creature's moans muffled by the thick insulated door. "We have to call someone," Anna urged, her fingers gripping her useless phone. "Screw that. We need to get the hell out of here," Nixon countered, his eyes still fixed on the vibrating freezer door. "But there's blood behind the counter. Maybe that guy attacked the clerk," Anna insisted, her voice shaking. "That's somebody else's problem," Grant replied firmly. "Grant's right. Once we get signal, we can call someone, but right now we really need to be somewhere else," Violet added, wiping the blood from her nose with the back of her hand. Everybody kept their eyes on the freezer door as they backed away from it. Once they got halfway to the exit, they turned and moved swiftly, only pausing at the door to make sure the creature in the freezer didn't have any friends lurking outside. "Move, move," Nixon commanded, pushing the door open and scanning the parking lot. The four of them rushed across the parking lot over to their car, Nixon grabbing the gas pump out of his car and tossing it aside before getting behind the wheel. Gasoline splashed onto the pavement, the sharp smell filling the air. He started up the car and threw it into drive, peeling out of the parking lot and back to the highway, speeding towards the outskirts of town. The tires squealed in protest as they accelerated away from the gas station. As they drove, they remained silent, looking around for trouble or signs of life. The only thing they were able to spot were several figures running in the streets between the houses. They were moving too fast to see if they were living or undead, but they didn't care which as long as they weren't coming their way. The early morning sun cast long shadows through the town, making it difficult to distinguish details. As they exited the town, Grant turned his attention to the radio, clicking it on and scanning the radio stations. Every time he stopped, there was music or commercials playing, confusing him. The normalcy of the broadcasts seemed surreal after what they had just experienced. "I don't know what's going on, but it can't be that bad if there's no news about it," Grant said, his brow furrowed as he continued to flip through stations. As if on cue, Nixon's phone dinged several times, the service returning long enough to deliver a night's worth of messages. The sudden noise made everyone in the car jump. "Check that for me, will you?" Nixon asked, keeping his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Grant nodded and grabbed his friend's phone from the cup holder. "It's Dawn. Okay, it's 20 messages from Dawn," Grant announced, his thumb scrolling through the notifications. Grant opened the messaging app up, scrolling through the messages, reading them to himself rather than aloud. His face grew increasingly pale as he scanned through the texts. Violet watched him for several seconds before speaking up. "You want to share with the class there, Grant?" Violet prodded, leaning forward from the back seat. Grant stared in disbelief at the messages until Violet shook him out of his stupor. He shook his head, snapping back into the moment. "I'm sorry, it's just taking me a moment to make sense of the messages," Grant replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are they saying?" Anna asked, her eyes wide with concern. "They're all over the place. Something about people attacking the bar that she and Caden were at. People biting and eating other people," Grant said, continuing to scroll through the messages. "That explains the teeth," Nixon muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "What are you talking about?" Violet questioned. "When that person or thing or whatever the hell it is was attacking me, it kept snapping at me. I saw hair and meat in its teeth, and I think it might have been flesh," Nixon explained, suppressing a shudder at the memory. "That's gross," Anna whispered, looking slightly nauseated. "It's what I saw," Nixon replied grimly. Grant continued reading the messages to himself before going white as a sheet. Violet noticed and again spoke up. "Don't make me smack you," she threatened, her patience wearing thin. I don't know," Grant stammered, his hand shaking as he held the phone. "Spit it out, man," Violet demanded. "Caden's dead," Grant finally said, his voice cracking. The car fell silent. Only the sound of the engine purring and the tires rolling on the pavement filled the car. The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating them all. "He's what?" Anna squeaked out, struggling to contain her emotions. "He's dead. At least, that's what Dawn texted," Grant confirmed, his eyes fixed on the phone screen. "Call her, right now," Nixon ordered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Grant nodded and switched over to phone mode, clicking on her name. The phone didn't ring, instead going straight to voicemail. The automated voice message seemed to mock them with its normalcy. "Her phone's not on," Grant reported, lowering the phone. The car fell silent again, each of them lost in their own thoughts, trying to process what was happening. "So what do we do?" Anna finally asked, her voice small. "We keep heading to the Outer Banks," Nixon decided, pressing down harder on the accelerator. "Are you sure that's wise?" Grant questioned, looking up from the phone. "Not in the least," Nixon admitted with a grim laugh. "But that town we just came from seemed to have some issues, and our friend is about 70 miles down the highway. I say we go look for her, because I know damn well she would do the same for us." Nixon continued, his voice gaining strength. The rest of the people in the car glanced at one another, nodding in agreement. The thought of abandoning their friend wasn't something any of them could stomach. "Okay, we're with you, Nixon," Grant said, speaking for the group. "Good. Now get strapped in because I'm going to pick up the pace," Nixon warned. Nixon pushed the pedal down further, the car picking up speed as it raced down the highway. The needle on the speedometer climbed steadily as they put distance between themselves and the town behind them, moving closer to their friend, who they hoped was still alive. Chapter 3. 8:30 a.m. The car sped down the highway, getting closer and closer to the bridge that would carry them over to the Outer Banks. Everyone was on edge as they continued to check their phones, hoping that their friend Dawn would reach out. The call never came. Nixon gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The speedometer hovered around 85, well above the posted limit, but traffic laws seemed irrelevant given what they'd witnessed back in Engelhard. In the passenger seat, Grant kept obsessively refreshing his phone, as if sheer willpower could make a signal appear. In the back seat, Violet stared out the window at the passing landscape, her mind racing through possible scenarios of what they might find ahead. Beside her, Anna fidgeted nervously with the zipper of her jacket, the repetitive sound of metal sliding up and down becoming a soundtrack to their tension. "We have to be getting close," Anna said, breaking the silence that had settled over the car like a suffocating blanket. Nixon kept his focus straight ahead, looking over to a mileage sign that was coming up. The Outer Banks was 5 miles away, with Roanoke Island being 3. The morning sun glinted off the sign, momentarily blinding him until he adjusted his visor. "What the heck is Roanoke Island?" Grant asked, finally looking up from his phone. "It's a little community just before hitting the main stretch of the Outer Banks," Violet replied, her voice flat and distant. "Hopefully it's not like the little community we just came from," Grant muttered, a nervous edge to his voice. Everybody in the car let out a deep sigh, knowing that Grant was right. They had no way of knowing what they were driving towards, only that they were hoping for the best. The memory of the gas station attendant's blood pooled on the floor, and the ghoul in the freezer hung over them like a dark cloud. "Does anybody remember the last time we passed another car?" Nixon asked suddenly, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The others in the car exchanged glances, everyone struggling to remember. It had been miles at a minimum, but how many was the question. The empty road stretched behind them, a ribbon of asphalt devoid of any signs of life. "It has to have been at least half an hour, maybe longer," Violet finally answered, trying to recall the last vehicle they'd seen. "Is that good or bad?" Anna asked, her voice small and uncertain. "This time of morning, you'd expect there to be at least some traffic coming from the island," Nixon replied, his brow furrowing with concern. "Maybe they're using the northern bridge," Grant suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "Maybe." Nixon spoke the words, even if he didn't believe it. Something about the emptiness of the road sent a chill down his spine, a warning that things were not as they should be. He kept driving, coming around the next corner to reveal the large bridge that would carry them over to their destination. The structure loomed ahead, stretching across the water like the spine of some massive creature. It was a 4-lane bridge, 2 lanes in each direction with a concrete barrier in between the directions. The group saw nobody on the road in either direction, all the way up to the first peak. The absence of traffic was eerie, especially for a popular tourist destination. Nixon kept his speed constant, anxious to get to the island, hoping that their friend was all right. As he came over the first hill, his attention was pulled to the lanes on the other side of the barrier. A car had spun out, crashing into the wall, smoke rising from the demolished engine. His first instinct was to slow down and help, but after the close encounter earlier in the morning, He was in no mood to put himself in danger. As they drove by, they could see movement inside the car. Two figures, one in the front seat and one in the back, thrashed about violently, caught up on their respective seatbelts. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, reminiscent of the man at the gas station. "Jesus," Grant whispered, turning in his seat to watch as they passed the wreck. The mood in the car soured quickly. Any hope that they had that the situation at the gas station was isolated faded. Whatever was happening on the island as well. The realization settled over them like a heavy weight, crushing their spirits. "Keep your eyes open, we're going to be hitting land soon," Nixon instructed, his voice tense as he focused on the road ahead. The group nodded as they continued over the bridge. They looked out to the water on either side of them, spotting a couple of boats, which was a fairly normal sight. What wasn't normal were the 3 cars coming down the other side of the highway, flashing their lights rapidly. "What are they doing?" Anna asked, watching the approaching vehicles with growing unease. Despite the visual warning, Nixon kept the pedal pressed to the floor, maintaining their speed. As they passed the trio of vehicles, the occupants of them waved frantically at them, seemingly trying to warn them of what was ahead. One man had half his body out the window, shouting something that was lost in the rush of air. "I don't feel good about this," Anna said, hugging herself tightly as if suddenly cold. "Neither do I, but Dawn's our friend and we're going to go get her," Nixon replied. The others knew he was right, even if they didn't want to admit it. They couldn't just abandon their friend based on some vague warnings from strangers. Still, the knot of dread in their stomachs tightened as they continued toward Roanoke Island. Within moments, they got the outskirts of Roanoke Island in view. From a distance, it looked fairly normal, the small community nestled against the water's edge, buildings gleaming in the morning sun. However, once they got back to land, it quickly became apparent that it was anything but normal. Nixon let off the gas as they came around a corner, followed by slamming on the brakes as he spotted a massive pileup at the major intersection ahead. The tires squealed in protest, the smell of burning rubber filling the car. "Holy shit," Violet breathed, leaning forward between the front seats to get a better view. At least 20 vehicles were tangled together in a mess, stretching out from the center of the intersection and into the parking lots and grass-covered areas beyond it. A pickup truck was overturned, its wheels still spinning lazily. A minivan had been T-boned so hard that it was almost folded in half. Glass and debris littered the road, glittering in the sunlight. But it was what moved among the wreckage that truly terrified them. Dozens of zombies roamed around, trying to break into cars, while some of the vehicles spun their tires in the grass, trying to break free and escape. Screams could be heard in the distance, along with the occasional car horn blaring in desperation. "We have to turn around, man," Grant urged, eyes wide with fear as he watched a ghoul slam its bloodied face repeatedly against a car window. "The hell we do," Nixon replied through gritted teeth. Nixon jerked the car to the left violently, aiming towards an open gap between 2 sets of wrecks. He increased the speed when a zombie stumbled out into the opening. The creature turned toward them, vacant eyes fixing on the approaching vehicle. "Hang on," Nixon shouted. Everybody braced for impact as the front end of the car slammed into the creature, sending it careening off the front bumper. The ghoul flew to the side, slamming into the side of another car with a thud, denting the side panel and leaving a splotch of blood on the window. The sickening sound of the impact made Anna gag, her hand flying to her mouth. Violet closed her eyes momentarily, trying to block out the image of the body flying through the air like a rag doll. The impact caused Nixon to lose control of the car, the tires squealing as he attempted to correct the spin-out. He managed to get control again just before they hit a grassy area, which destabilized them again. "Nixon, careful!" Grant shouted, hands braced against the dashboard. Everyone in the car screamed as they spun around several times, skidding across the street before slamming into an overturned car. The collision was jarring, throwing them all forward against their seatbelts before snapping them back against their seats. The engine fell silent, sputtering when Nixon turned the key. Come on," Nixon urged desperately, turning the key again and again. The engine squealed, protesting the attempted start. A couple seconds later, smoke began to rise from underneath the hood, followed by a horrific metallic noise that sounded like gears being stripped of their teeth. No, Nixon pounded the steering wheel with his palm, panic rising in his voice. Violet shook off the effects of the wreck, her head still spinning slightly from the impact. She looked out towards the road, spotting a handful of creatures across the street turning in their direction. Their attention had been drawn by the noise of the crash, and now they moved with singular purpose toward the disabled vehicle. "We have to move," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. It'll start. Nixon continued turning the key, praying that it would start up. However, with each turn the engine noise got worse and worse, until it sounded like the internal components were tearing themselves apart. Violet had enough, knowing their time was short. She threw open her door, reaching back in and grabbing Anna, who was still out of it, her eyes unfocused from the impact of the crash. "Come on, girl, we have to move," Violet urged, pulling her friend toward the door. Anna quickly undid her seatbelt, crawling out of the back seat with Violet's help, her movements sluggish and uncoordinated. A second later, Violet ripped open Nixon's door, yelling, "Forget it, we have to go." Nixon looked past her, spotting half a dozen zombies running in their direction, closing the distance rapidly. Their movements were unnaturally fast, arms pumping as they sprinted across the pavement. He quickly undid his seatbelt, crawling out and clearing a path for Grant to do the same. "Move it, Grant, now!" Nixon shouted. As soon as Grant's feet hit the pavement, the four of them were running up the road, zombies in pursuit. Anna stumbled initially, her balance still off from the crash, but Violet grabbed her arm, keeping her upright as they fled. "Don't look back, just run," Violet commanded, her grip tight on Anna's wrist. The stretch of road ahead was clear, businesses lining the streets on either side. Violet led the pack, looking side to side, hoping to see an open business that they could take refuge in, but seeing none. Every door was locked, every window dark and uninviting. As they got a block up, she looked to her right, spotting a chain-link fence that enclosed a back parking lot of a bar. The fence was at least 7 feet tall, but it was their only option as the sounds of pursuing footsteps grew closer. "The fence! Get over it!" Violet changed course, the others following her lead. She glanced back over her shoulder, watching as the half-dozen zombies in pursuit changed their course as well. They moved with a frightening single-mindedness, their vacant eyes never wavering from their prey. Violet hit the fence first, jumping up and grabbing on near the top, kicking off and pulling herself over in a single motion. The metal links dug into her palms, but adrenaline dulled the pain as she swung her legs over and dropped to the other side. She landed on the ground, stumbling forward before turning and nearly catching Anna as she slipped off the top. Anna's foot had caught in the fence, causing her to tumble awkwardly over the top. "I got you, girl, I got you," Violet said, steadying her friend as she landed. Anna patted her friend on the arm, letting her know that she was okay, though her breathing was ragged from the exertion. A couple seconds later, Grant and Nixon landed safely on their side of the fence, Grant wincing as he twisted his ankle slightly on the landing. A few seconds after that, the first of the zombies reached them, slamming into the fence with enough force to make the entire structure rattle. The metal links squealed in protest as the creatures pressed against it. The foursome braced themselves for a battle, relieved to see that none of the zombies tried to climb the fence. The creatures pressed their faces against the chain link, trying to will themselves through. Their fingers curled through the openings, reaching helplessly as they moaned with frustration. "Why aren't they climbing?" Anna asked, watching the ghouls with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Who cares? Let's just be thankful that they aren't," Grant replied, still trying to catch his breath. More zombies arrived, pressing against the fence, their combined weight causing the structure to bow slightly inward. Their moans grew louder, a chorus of hunger and frustration. "I'm sorry, y'all, I swear I thought I could make it through," Nixon said, running a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. "It's okay, Nixon," Anna replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "I mean, it's really not okay given that we're out here exposed, but we'll bust your chops later. Because right now we need to figure out where to go," Violet stated bluntly, already scanning their surroundings for an escape route. Grant walked over to the back door of the bar, pulling on the handle but finding it locked up tight. He rattled the doorknob several times before giving up. There were no windows on the back side of the building, giving them no entry point. "Well, that's not gonna work," he announced, returning to the group. "So where do we go?" Anna asked. Violet looked around, seeing more zombies coming up to join the others at the fence. She ignored them for the moment, turning around to the back of the lot and spotting several rows of houses in the distance. The residential area stretched out beyond the commercial strip, rows of rooftops visible through the trees. "Let's hit the neighborhood. Surely there's somebody who will let us in," Violet suggested, pointing toward the houses. "Most of those places are likely vacation houses. We just need to find one that's empty and get inside," Nixon added, already moving toward the edge of the parking lot. "Isn't that breaking and entering?" Anna questioned, her law-abiding nature still asserting itself despite their dire circumstances. "With any luck, someone will see us and send the cops our way," Grant replied sarcastically, limping slightly as he followed Nixon. Anna thought about it for a moment before shaking her head, realizing that Grant was right. In their current situation, legal concerns were the least of their worries. Violet grabbed Anna's hand, gently pulling her towards the back of the lot. "Come on, let's find someplace to lay low." Chapter 4. Violet led the foursome through the neighborhood, walking on the side of the road at a brisk pace. Everyone kept their heads on a swivel, looking for trouble as well as potential places to hide. The morning sun beat down on them, already warming the air, despite the early hour. "See anything?" Nixon asked in a hushed voice, scanning the houses as they passed. "Nothing yet," Violet replied, her eyes darting between the structures around them. All of the houses on the street were raised up on stilts, a common occurrence this close to the coast. The wooden pillars elevated the living areas by at least 10 feet, providing a barrier between the homes and potential flooding. Stairways zigzagged upward to front doors that seemed unreachably high from their vantage point. Every time a hurricane blows through, the water level tends to get high, and the raised homes saved them on multiple occasions. Now, though, the stilts created an eerie forest of shadows beneath each building, dark spaces where anything or anyone could be hiding. "How are we supposed to get into one of these?" Grant asked, looking up at the elevated structures. His ankle still throbbed from their fence-jumping escape, causing him to limp slightly as they walked. "Most of them have ground-level storage or garage areas," Violet explained. "Sometimes there's access to the main house from inside." Anna wrapped her arms around herself, though the morning wasn't cold. Her eyes darted nervously between the houses, imagining creatures lurking beneath each one. She'd been quiet since their escape from the fence, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. "Let's just pick a house and get inside," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nixon and Grant looked at the homes high above, spotting movement in some of the windows. However, they couldn't tell if it was human or zombie. Curtains swayed in one, shadows passed by another. The distance and angle made it impossible to distinguish friend from foe. "I'm not sure if anyone up there would be too keen on letting strangers in right now," Nixon remarked, his eyes fixed on a window where he thought he'd seen a figure watching them. "Your guess is as good as mine, boys. Let's pick one that looks empty and give it a shot," Violet suggested, pointing to a blue house about 50 yards ahead. It stood slightly apart from its neighbors, all of its windows dark. As they moved toward the house, Grant's eyes remained fixed on the homes they passed. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, vulnerable out in the open like this. A flash of movement in a ground-level carport caught his attention, but when he looked directly at it, nothing was there. "Anyone else feel like we're being hunted?" he asked, unable to keep the nervous edge from his voice. "We probably are," Violet replied matter-of-factly. "Just keep moving." Before they could agree on a house, they heard footsteps coming from behind them. The sound of rapid slapping feet against pavement made them all freeze momentarily before turning to look. They turned to see 3 zombies emerging from a side street, laying eyes on them and sprinting in their direction. The creatures moved at a terrifying pace, their faces contorted in hungry expressions, arms outstretched as they closed the distance. "Jesus Christ!" Grant's voice cracked with fear as the creatures bore down on them. Grant's instincts took over, propelling him up the road as fast as his legs would carry him. The rest of the group followed suit until Violet caught up with him. Her lungs burned as she pushed herself to match his pace, the adrenaline giving her a burst of speed. As she got within arm's reach, she grabbed onto his shirt, pulling him to the side in the direction of a driveway. He was startled at first, but quickly realized what was happening. The rough yank nearly made him lose his balance, but he corrected and followed her lead. "This way," she shouted to the others, veering sharply toward a nearby house. The four of them ran towards the house just a few yards away as the zombies continued to close the distance. The exterior stairs were locked up tight with a wooden door. However, there was a ground-level entrance. Nixon rushed up to it, turning the doorknob, finding it locked. He rattled it violently, as if sheer desperation might break the mechanism. "Damn it," he growled through clenched teeth. The others crowded behind him, their ragged breathing and pounding hearts creating a symphony of fear. The zombies were less than 30 yards away now, their excited moans carrying on the morning air. "Back up," Nixon commanded, planting his feet and preparing to force the door. Everyone did as instructed, giving him room. Nixon stepped up and delivered a forceful kick to the door right at the knob. The lock was stronger than he thought, causing his leg to radiate with pain and doing little to free it from its frame. The door shuddered but held firm, the deadbolt refusing to give way. Come on," he muttered, preparing for another attempt. He tried again, resulting in more pain and little progress. The vibration shot up his leg, making his knee throb. Sweat beaded on his forehead as frustration mixed with panic. The noise, however, drew the attention of a creature in the backyard. The ghoul came around the corner, letting out a satisfied moan at the sight of fresh meat. "Look out!" Grant shouted, spotting the new threat before the others. Grant reached out and shoved Anna out of the way as the creature lunged. Anna stumbled into Violet's arms, both of them struggling to remain upright. The zombie's fingers grazed Anna's shoulder as she fell away from its reach. The zombie adjusted its focus onto Grant, reaching out for his arm and grabbing a hold. Before he knew what happened, the ghoul bit into his forearm, ripping out a chunk of flesh, sending a spurt of blood through the air. The pain was immediate and intense, like fire racing up his arm. "Grant!" Anna's scream pierced the air, high-pitched and desperate. Grant's face contorted in agony as he tried to pull away from the creature's grip. Blood poured from the wound, soaking his sleeve and dripping onto the concrete below. The zombie's teeth were stained red as it prepared for another bite. Anna's scream drew the zombie's attention, who looked over to the women. Before it could pursue them, Violet shoved Anna towards an outdoor shower contained within a wooden box. She pulled the door shut behind them, providing a small bit of protection. Inside the shower enclosure, the space was tight, barely enough room for the two of them to stand. The walls were thin wooden slats, clearly not designed to withstand any serious assault. Violet pressed her back against the door, feeling it shudder as the ghoul hit it from the outside. "Come on!" Nixon grabbed his injured friend by the arm, pulling him towards the backyard as the zombie focused its attention on the two women in the outdoor shower. It banged against the wood, which was quickly giving way. Inside the shower, Anna pressed herself against the far wall, her breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. Violet braced herself against the door, feeling it bend with each impact. Splinters of wood broke free, a few falling to the shower floor. "It's not going to hold," Violet whispered, her muscles straining against the assault. Nixon and Grant stumbled into the backyard, where Nixon immediately spotted a small shed. He pulled his injured friend along, throwing open the door, revealing a bevy of yard tools. Rakes, shovels, and various gardening implements hung from hooks on the walls while a lawnmower sat in the corner. Grant clutched his wounded arm, blood seeping between his fingers. The pain was making him lightheaded, but he fought to stay focused. "Come on, we have to help them," Nixon said, scanning the shed for anything useful. Nixon snatched a pair of shears off the wall, giving them a practice snap while Grant grabbed a claw hammer. The cold metal felt reassuring in their hands, giving them at least some means of defense. With a silent nod, they turned back to the carport in the outdoor shower, where the zombie continued pressing against the wooden door. The creature's persistent assault had begun to splinter the wood, its fingers now visible through cracks in the door. Inside, Violet continued to brace against it, but her strength was failing. Anna stood frozen, eyes wide with terror. Before they could take a step forward, however, the three zombies that had pursued them down the street came into view, all of them drawn to the noise the zombie at the shower was making. They moved with singular purpose, their excitement growing as they closed in on their prey. "Damn it," Nixon muttered, pulling Grant back behind the corner of the house. Nixon peeked out, watching the trio of creatures join the other at the shower, pressing against the door. The combined force of 4 zombies made the entire structure shake. A loud crack signaled that the wood was beginning to fail. "They're not going to be able to hold that very long," Nixon observed, his mind racing for a solution. "What do you want to do?" Grant asked, his voice tight with pain. Nixon looked at his large pair of shears, shaking his head. Against 4 zombies, the odds weren't good, but they couldn't just abandon the girls. "Just follow me and be ready to use that hammer," Nixon instructed, his expression grim but determined. Grant nodded, wincing as the pain in his arm throbbed from his injury. Blood continued to seep from the wound, running down his hand and dripping from his fingertips. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the task ahead. Nixon led them out from the shed, darting over to the back of the house as quietly as he could. He moved up to the corner of the carport, looking over to the creatures just a couple of yards away. All 4 were now pressed against the shower door, their combined weight causing the wood to bow inward. From inside, he could hear Anna's muffled sobs and Violet's strained grunts as she fought to keep the door closed. They were running out of time. Nixon gently tapped the tip of the shears onto the concrete, just loud enough to hopefully get the attention of some of the zombies. Much to his surprise, it worked. The 2 creatures in the back, who couldn't quite reach the door, looked over in his direction, their dead eyes focusing on the source of the sound. Without hesitation, they broke away from the others, closing the gap in a matter of seconds. As they got close, Nixon stepped out, raising the shears up and planting them in the lead zombie's chest. The creature hit them with enough force to send them straight through, only stopping when Nixon opened them up and created a bit of a barrier with the handle. The blades of the shears protruded from the zombie's back, dark blood oozing around the metal. The zombie was incredibly close, just a few inches away from Nixon, grabbing onto his shoulder and trying to pull him in. Its breath was foul, the smell of decay overwhelming as its teeth snapped just inches from Nixon's face. The ghoul just behind them slammed into the tip of the shears that protruded from the lead ghoul, getting stuck on them. Nixon wanted to scream out as terror filled him, but he kept quiet, knowing that any loud sound would overwhelm them. He could feel the zombie's fingers digging into his shoulder, the strength in its grip surprising. He pulled back as much as he could as the zombie tried to pull him closer. Before the creature could bite, Grant swung his hammer, connecting with the top of the zombie's skull, cracking it. The sound was sickening, like an egg breaking, but much wetter. The zombie staggered a bit, dropping only when Grant delivered a second blow, sending a spurt of blood back into the second zombie's face. Dark fluid splattered across its vacant eyes, momentarily blinding it. The lifeless body of the zombie began to drop, and Nixon shoved it forward, managing to push it on top of the second creature. The ghoul stumbled backwards, landing on the ground with its friend on top. It thrashed beneath the weight, arms flailing as it tried to free itself. Grant darted forward, delivering a kill strike to the zombie's head. The hammer came down with brutal force, crushing the skull beneath it. The creature went still, its arms falling limp at its sides. "Somebody help us!" Violet's desperate cry came from the shower, the door now cracking audibly under the assault of the remaining 2 zombies. Nixon yanked his shears free, walking quickly to the side of the shower, the 2 creatures pushing against the door that was failing under their assault. He gave Grant a nod before stepping forward, shoving the shears into the closest creature's back. He put his full weight against them, holding the creatures at bay as Grant did the dirty work again, delivering hammer strikes to both of the zombies' heads, ending their unlife. Grant brought the hammer down repeatedly, ensuring the threat was neutralized. As the zombies collapsed to the ground, the 2 men stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, wiping blood from their faces as the shower door opened. Both were spattered with dark fluid, their clothes stained with evidence of their desperate fight. Violet glanced out, seeing the creatures on the ground and their friends standing tall. Nixon puffed out his chest a little, proud of their violent heroics. Despite the fear and horror of the moment, there was a primal satisfaction in having defeated the threat, in having protected their friends. "Come on, let's get inside." Chapter 5. Nixon marched over to the basement door of the house, his bloody shears firmly in hand. The others followed him, keeping a close eye on the street and backyard, not wanting to be surprised. Every few seconds, one of them would glance over their shoulders, expecting to see more ghouls emerging from the shadows. The shear's blades were coated in dark fluid, small chunks of matter still clinging to the metal. Nixon ignored it, his focus entirely on getting them to safety. The street behind them remained quiet for the moment, but they all knew it was only a matter of time before more of those things appeared. "Hurry!" Anna whispered urgently, her eyes darting between Grant's injured arm and the bodies they'd left behind. Nixon closed the shears tight, shoving them into the door, right at the knob, wedging the tip in between the door and the frame. The metal creaked as he applied pressure, using the tool as a makeshift pry bar. It took a moment of doing, but he managed to pry the door open, the wood splintering around the lock with a satisfying crack. "We're in," he announced. He moved in first, keeping his makeshift weapon at the ready, stepping past a small pool table over to the stairs that led up to the main living space. The basement area was dim, with only small windows near the ceiling letting in shafts of morning light. The scent of mustiness and sea salt hung in the air. The other three slid inside, closing the door as best they could. The broken lock made it impossible to secure completely, leaving them vulnerable. Grant, still clutching his wounded arm, looked around the room before focusing on the pool table. "Help me with the table," Grant said, moving toward the heavy piece of furniture. Grant used his one good arm as the two women lifted up, moving the relatively heavy gaming table over to the door. Their muscles strained with the effort, but fear gave them strength they didn't know they had. The felt-covered table scraped across the concrete floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the confined space. Once in position, Violet tried pulling the door open, and it barely moved. The table's bulk provided at least some barrier between them and whatever might try to come in. "It's good enough for now," Violet said, wiping sweat from her brow. They turned back to Nixon, who stared up at the second floor, expecting movement. His body was tense, ears straining for any sound that might indicate danger. The house above them seemed quiet, but that didn't necessarily mean it was empty. "There was a car in the driveway, so be ready for anything," Nixon warned, his voice low. The others nodded as Violet stepped over to Grant, taking the hammer from him. At first, he protested silently, a flash of masculine pride making him reluctant to relinquish the weapon, but quickly realized Violet could handle herself. His arm throbbed with pain, blood still seeping through his fingers as he clutched the wound. With a tap on the shoulder, Violet let Nixon know she was ready to move. The two of them moved in unison up the stairs, Nixon in the lead. Each step creaked under their weight, the sound seeming to echo through the house. Anna stayed back with Grant, helping him sit on a nearby chair while keeping her eyes fixed on her friends as they ascended. As he got close to the top of the stairs, he could see a kitchen and living room area to the left, and a hallway leading to the bedrooms on the right. The space was tastefully decorated in typical beach house style. Wicker furniture, blue and white color scheme, and nautical accents scattered throughout. No sign of inhabitants yet, but the place had a lived-in feel. As soon as his feet hit the top, a door down the hallway opened. The sound made Nixon freeze, his grip tightening on the shears. A booming voice bellowed as an average-sized man stepped out holding a baseball bat. He emerged from what appeared to be the master bedroom, his stance wide and aggressive, knuckles white as he gripped his improvised weapon. "You picked the wrong house to rob, asshole," the man shouted, his face flushed with anger. The man, presumably the homeowner, was in his mid-40s, with salt and pepper hair and the sturdy build of someone who knew his way around physical labor. He wore khaki shorts and a faded t-shirt, clearly having dressed in a hurry after hearing their entrance. David took a few steps down the hallway and Nixon lowered his weapon, putting up one hand in a defensive position, speaking rapidly. Wait, we're not here to rob you," Nixon said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the bat being brandished in his direction. David stopped when he got a better look at Nixon, his clothes stained with blood. His eyes widened, taking in the gruesome sight of the young man covered in dark splatters. "So you're here to kill us?" David asked, his voice lower but no less threatening as he raised the bat higher. Nixon stammered, trying to form words, but Violet chimed in from the stairs, her voice steady and reasonable, in contrast to the tension filling the room. "You haven't looked outside lately, have you?" she asked. slowly climbing the last few steps to join Nixon. "What are you talking about?" David demanded, his eyes darting between the two intruders. "Something is very wrong out there. People are going crazy and killing people," Violet explained, her tone matter-of-fact despite the horror of her words. "No shit, I have a madman standing in my living room covered in blood," David retorted, gesturing toward Nixon with the bat. "It was self-defense," Nixon protested, becoming increasingly frustrated with the man's hostility. "Yeah, that's what they all say," David scoffed, clearly unconvinced. From the bottom of the stairs, Grant's voice called up, strained with pain but determined to be heard. "He's telling the truth." Grant gently pushed his way past Violet, holding out his injured arm so that David could see it. His sleeve was soaked through with blood, the fabric torn where the creature had bitten him. The wound was ugly, a chunk of flesh missing, the edges ragged and beginning to swell. David's eyes went wide at the sight of the bite. His bat lowered slightly as shock replaced anger on his face. "Jesus Christ, did a dog bite you?" he asked, revulsion evident in his voice. "A human, or at least something that used to be human," Grant replied grimly. "Used to be human? What are you talking about?" David's brow furrowed in confusion, the bat now hanging limply at his side. "That's what we're trying to tell you. People are going crazy," Violet explained, gesturing toward the windows. "They're attacking people, biting them, and it's spreading." Before David could respond, his wife Rachel yelled out from the bedroom. Her voice was high with fear, cutting through the tension in the hallway. "Oh my God, David, something is attacking the neighbors." Nixon shrugged slightly, as if to say, "See, I told you so." His expression wasn't smug, merely resigned to the horrible reality they were all now facing. "Go have a look," Nixon suggested quietly. David raised his baseball bat towards Nixon in a menacing manner, the young man not impressed in the least. Despite the evidence mounting before him, David wasn't ready to trust these bloody strangers who'd broken into his home. "Don't you move," he warned, backing toward the bedroom while keeping his eyes on the intruders. "I'll stay right here. Go look," Nixon replied, remaining perfectly still to avoid provoking the man. David retreated back to the bedroom, where his wife Rachel was staring through the blinds. She was a petite woman with short blonde hair, her face pale with fear, as she watched something horrific unfolding in the neighboring house. He stepped up, pulling them aside and looking to the house across from them. The morning sun illuminated the neighboring property clearly, leaving nothing to the imagination. "Where am I looking?" David asked, squinting through the bright light. "Back bedroom on the right," Rachel directed, her voice shaking. David adjusted his view, watching one of the vacationing neighbors pressed up against the window, bleeding out as a zombie ripped at his shoulder with its mouth. The man's face was contorted in agony, his palms flat against the glass as if begging for help that wouldn't come. The creature behind him continued to tear at his flesh, oblivious to being observed. "What the hell?" David whispered, his knuckles white on the edge of the blinds. "David, what is going on? Who is out there?" Rachel asked, tugging at her husband's sleeve. David contemplated for a moment, his tough guy act softening in an instant as the reality of the situation sank in, the baseball bat lowered to his side as his shoulders slumped. "People who need our help. Grab the med kit," he said, his voice gentler now. Rachel nodded and went to the bathroom, retrieving the kit and joining her husband in the front room. The plastic case looked woefully inadequate for the level of injury they were facing, but it was better than nothing. As they re-entered the living area, David's demeanor had completely changed. Gone was the aggressive defender, replaced by a man coming to terms with a world suddenly gone mad. "I'm David, and this is my wife Rachel," he said, gesturing to the woman beside him. "And Nixon, the one with the hammer, is Violet. And that's Anna and Grant," Nixon replied, pointing to each in turn. Everyone nodded politely towards one another at the introductions. Rachel stepped forward, motioning for Grant to follow her. Her nursing instincts had kicked in, overriding her initial fear of the strangers. "There's a bathroom right here. Come on, I'll patch you up as best I can," she offered, leading the way down the hall. "I appreciate it," Grant said weakly, the adrenaline that had kept him going now fading, leaving pain in its wake. Grant moved past everybody, joining Rachel in the bathroom. She visibly winced as she saw the extent of the injury under the bright bathroom lights. The bite was deep, exposing muscle tissue, and the edges were already showing signs of infection, despite how recently it had occurred. "Yeah, tell me about it," Grant remarked dryly, noticing her reaction. As they vanished into the bathroom, David led the others into the front room, motioning for them to sit down as he put on a pot of coffee. The normalcy of the action seemed surreal given the circumstances, but it gave him something to do, a routine to cling to in the face of chaos. "So what is going on out there?" David asked, measuring scoops of coffee into the filter with hands that weren't quite steady. "I wish I knew. All we know is people are going crazy and ripping others to shreds," Nixon replied, sinking onto the couch with a weary sigh. "There's no news as far as we can tell. Everything we know we got from our friend Dawn, who is at the Outer Banks," Violet added, choosing to remain standing near the window where she could keep an eye on the street. "Well, can you get her on the phone? Because I have some questions," David said, his tone slightly demanding despite his attempt to be civil. "We've tried calling her, but it goes straight to voicemail," Nixon explained, running a hand through his hair in frustration. David paused his coffee preparations, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Do you know the number for the house?" he asked. Nixon and Violet looked at each other, both of them having a "I'm an idiot" realization. The thought of calling the rental house's landline hadn't occurred to either of them. "I'll check my email for the confirmation email. I'm pretty sure the number is in there," Violet said, pulling out her phone. Violet scrolled through her phone, finding the email and clicking on it. After a quick scan, she spotted the house number, her face lighting up with the first glimmer of hope they'd had all morning. "Bingo, let's hope she's home," she said, relief evident in her voice. Violet hit dial, putting her cell phone onto speaker mode so everyone could hear. It rang a few times before a man answered, his voice unfamiliar to them. Hello?" the man said hesitantly. "Who the hell is this?" Violet demanded, immediately on guard. "The name's Lucas. I suppose you're looking for Dawn," he replied, seemingly unfazed by her hostile tone. "Yeah, how did you know?" Violet asked, suspicion evident in her voice. "You must be her friends that were driving in. Give me a second and I'll get her," Lucas explained. Before Violet could speak, Lucas put the phone down on the counter, calling out to the other room. The muffled sound of voices came through the speaker, followed by hurried footsteps. A few seconds later, Dawn's voice came through, bringing a wave of relief to her friends. "Violet, Anna, is that you?" Dawn asked, her voice breathless with excitement. "It's Violet, girl. We're all safe. But are you?" "Who the hell is Lucas, and why is he answering the phone?" Violet questioned, her protective instincts kicking in despite her relief. "I'm safe, mostly thanks to Lucas. It's a long story, but things went really bad at the Pier restaurant last night," Dawn explained, her voice growing serious. "Well, whatever is happening there is happening here too," Violet informed her, watching as David poured coffee into mugs and distributed them. "Where are you?" Dawn asked, concern evident in her tone. "We're close. We're on Roanoke Island," Violet replied, taking the mug David offered her with a grateful nod. David stepped over, handing out a couple cups of coffee to people. He made eye contact with Violet, silently asking if he could talk. She gave him a subtle nod, understanding his need for information. "Dawn, my new friend David has some questions for you," Violet said, holding the phone toward him. "Okay, hi David," Dawn said, her voice wary but cooperative. "Hello, Dawn. Do you know what's going on out there?" David asked, leaning toward the phone. "Nothing official, only that everybody at the emergency services is gone. People are incredibly violent, and we can't get 5 feet out our door without being taken out," Dawn replied grimly. "Jesus Christ. So what are we supposed to do?" David's voice was strained, the magnitude of the situation finally hitting him. "I'll tell you what Officer Bowman told us last night. If you can get to a boat, any boat, get out to the water," Dawn advised, her tone suggesting this wasn't open for debate. "And then what?" David pressed, needing more than just a temporary solution. "He didn't know, but he said that's what he was going to do," Dawn admitted. "If it's good enough for the police, it's good enough for me," Violet interjected, finishing her coffee in one long gulp. "Are you safe?" "Because we were trying to mount a rescue after getting your text messages," Nixon asked, leaning closer to the phone. "I appreciate the thought, but you really need to take care of yourselves. Find a boat and get out onto the water," Dawn urged, her concern for her friends evident. "Okay, Dawn, that's what we're going to do. Once we're on the water, we'll call you back and see what we can do for you," Nixon promised, determination setting his jaw. "Thanks, Nixon," Dawn replied, her voice softening with gratitude. "Girl, I gotta cut this short. My phone is running out of juice," Violet interrupted, noticing her battery indicator flashing red. "Please be safe," Dawn pleaded. "We will, girl," Violet assured her, though none of them felt confident in that promise. Violet hit end call, and David immediately pointed to the kitchen, where a phone charging cable was plugged into the wall. Violet nodded and went to hook up her phone, relieved that they hadn't completely lost contact with their friend. As the phone began to charge, Nixon turned to David, his expression serious but tinged with hope. "So, David, I don't suppose you have a boat, do you?" he asked directly. "I can't say that I do, but a lot of our neighbors do," David replied, moving to the window to scan the surrounding houses. "Well, let's do a little window shopping and see if we can't find ourselves a nice one." Chapter 6. Nixon and Violet stood by the patio door, looking out at the street from behind cover, not wanting to risk letting any roaming zombies know they were there. They kept low, just their eyes above the window ledge, scanning the surrounding properties for any sign of salvation. A couple of creatures wandered by as they looked, shambling down the middle of the road with the uneven gait that had become disturbingly familiar. One wore the tattered remains of a bathing suit, the other dressed in what might have been restaurant attire. Both were covered in dark stains, their vacant eyes continuously scanning for prey. "There has to be more out there," Nixon whispered, his breath fogging the glass slightly. "Almost definitely," Violet agreed, keeping her voice low despite being inside. "But where are they?" The two of them scanned the driveways, hoping to see boats, but seeing nothing but empty driveways and family minivans. "This isn't going well," Violet said, frustration evident in her voice as she continued to scan the neighborhood. "There's got to be something out there," Nixon replied, not willing to give up so easily. Behind them, the others were scattered around the living room. Anna sat beside Grant on the couch, examining his bandaged arm with concern. The wound had been cleaned and wrapped by Rachel, but the bite looked worse than a typical injury. The skin around it had already taken on an alarming reddish-purple hue that spread outward from under the gauze. Rachel worked in the kitchen, the sounds and smells of breakfast preparation creating an illusion of normalcy that none of them truly felt. The routine task seemed to calm her, giving her something to focus on besides the horror outside. David walked out from the back bedroom carrying a couple pairs of binoculars, extending them over to the two others. The binoculars were high quality, the kind used for birdwatching or boating, appropriate for coastal living. "Here, these might help," he offered, his earlier hostility completely gone, replaced by a pragmatic desire to help. Violet and Nixon nodded thanks as David turned back to Rachel, who was flipping pancakes with mechanical precision, her movements automatic while her mind clearly wrestled with their situation. "I know we don't want to, but we need to get out onto the patio so we can see," Violet suggested. "Yeah, I know. Just stay low and quiet when we do," Nixon agreed, adjusting the focus on his binoculars. Violet nodded as she unlatched the patio door. With a nod, she gently pulled it open, the glass door sliding effortlessly along the track. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet morning, making both of them wince. Nixon and Violet slipped out onto the patio, staying low as they moved to either side of the deck to look down the street with their binoculars. The wooden planks of the deck were warm under their hands as they crawled into position, careful to stay below the railing. Violet scanned the next block, looking intently for any signs of a boat they could borrow. Most of the houses were similar to the one they occupied, raised structures with carports underneath and patios overlooking the street. Some had cars in the driveways, others were empty. None seemed to offer what they needed. She was about to give up when something caught her eye. She perked up when she spotted a large black truck backed into the driveway about halfway down the next block. She moved slightly back and forth to try and look around some trees, managing to get in just the right spot. While she couldn't see the entire boat, she could see that the truck had a silver trailer hooked up to the back and the front end of what looked like a boat. The vessel's white hull gleamed in the morning sun, a beacon of hope amid their dire circumstances. She turned around, letting out a light clicking noise to get Nixon's attention. He turned from his position at the other end of the deck, eyebrows raised in question. Once he turned, she motioned for him to come over. She pointed out what she saw, and after a moment of looking, a grin formed on his face. The boat wasn't large, but it was seaworthy enough to get them away from the island and the growing horde of creatures. "That might work," he whispered, excitement building in his voice. The two of them retreated back inside, shutting the door and securing it. "Okay, we're in business," Violet announced, drawing the attention of the others in the room. "What did you see?" David asked, moving away from the kitchen counter where he'd been helping Rachel prepare plates. "Halfway down the next block across the street, there's a house with a big black truck in the driveway, and it has a boat on a trailer hooked up to it," Nixon explained, gesturing in the direction of their discovery. David and Rachel exchanged a concerned glance as his wife brought a couple plates of food into the living room. The look didn't go unnoticed by Violet. "Out with it. What do you know that we don't know?" Violet pressed, her tone making it clear she wasn't going to accept evasion. "We've had some trouble with that house this week. It's a party house, and they were rattling our windows," David admitted reluctantly. "It's a good thing we're not going over there with friendly intent," Nixon remarked, his expression hardening. David looked at him confused, a frown forming as he processed Nixon's words. "You want to rob them even if they haven't gone crazy?" he asked, his moral compass still functioning despite the chaos around them. "It seems like the entire world has gone crazy," Nixon replied, gesturing toward the window where they could still see occasional zombies wandering past. "And the only way we can find out if they are crazy is by paying them a visit," Violet added pragmatically, already mentally preparing for what they might find. David hesitated, torn between his ethical principles and the growing recognition that survival might require actions he'd never have considered a day ago. "I want your word that we aren't going to hurt them if they're like us," he finally said, his gaze moving between Nixon and Violet. Nixon and Violet exchanged a knowing glance, both of them saying, "All right," in unison, even though they weren't sure if they believed it. The truth was, they didn't know what they'd do if confronted with hostile but human survivors. David wasn't sure either, but he knew they had to at least try. "Okay, I'm coming with you," David announced, his decision made. "Grab your bat and come on," Violet replied, picking up her hammer from where it rested against the wall. Rachel grabbed David by the arm, stopping him. Her eyes were wide with fear, her grip on her husband's arm so tight her knuckles turned white. "David, this is crazy," she protested, her voice trembling. "I know, but I think we're going to be a lot safer out on the water," David replied gently, covering her hand with his own. Rachel contemplated for a moment, nodding in agreement. She gave him a big kiss before turning him loose, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You be safe and come back to me," she urged, straightening his collar in a gesture of domesticity that seemed from another lifetime. "I will," he promised, though none of them knew if such promises held any meaning anymore. "The rest of you follow us. You're going to need to put that pool table back into place," Nixon instructed, turning toward the stairs that led down to the basement. Everyone got up and followed the raiding party to the basement, moving the pool table quickly and allowing the trio to exit. As they stepped out onto the carport, Violet kept her hammer held high as Nixon brandished his shears. David gasped as he saw the carnage in front of the outdoor shower, immediately locking in, knowing that this was for real. The bodies of the zombies they'd dispatched earlier lay where they'd fallen, dark fluid pooling beneath them on the concrete. The sight steeled his resolve. This wasn't some elaborate prank or mass hysteria. The threat was real and deadly. Violet motioned for the boys to follow, moving to the back of the house and staying in the small backyards. The route to the next street was clear, the trio pausing at the edge of the house. They looked down the street in both directions, relieved to not see any movement. Violet led them out, darting across the street and into the next yard. The grass was damp with morning dew, soaking through their shoes as they crouched behind a decorative shrub. A few moments later, they took a position beside the house directly across from the target. They pressed their backs against the vinyl siding, catching their breath and gathering courage for the next move. They looked over, seeing not only the truck but a modest-sized fishing boat sitting on the trailer. It was about 20 feet long, with an outboard motor and a small cabin area, more than enough to get them away from the island. "That's a beautiful sight," Nixon whispered, his eyes locked on their potential salvation. "So what do we do? Just go up to the door, knock, and ask for the keys?" David asked, his attempt at sarcasm undermined by the genuine uncertainty in his voice. "I don't think that would do much good," Violet replied grimly. Violet pointed up to the patio, which had a smashed door and blood dripping down onto the concrete driveway. The sliding glass door had been shattered, with dark smears visible on the remaining fragments still in the frame. "Jesus," Nixon muttered. "On the plus side, we know what we have to do," Violet said, her expression grim but determined. She looked over to David, who gave her a nod, letting her know he was on board with what needed to be done. The moral qualms about stealing had evaporated in the face of the grisly evidence before them. "Okay, we get in, find the keys, and get the hell out. I'll take point, I'll hold them in place, and let you two take them out. If we can bottleneck them, that's what we'll do," Nixon detailed, formulating a plan on the fly. The others nodded and waited for Nixon to make his move. The moments stretched out as they observed the house, watching for any sign of movement within. Finally, Nixon took a deep breath and steeled himself. Before too long, he broke from cover, the three of them racing across the street. Their footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the pavement, each impact sending alarm bells ringing in their minds. As they crossed, they looked down the street, seeing movement a few blocks away, but luckily the creatures didn't head their way. The zombies continued their aimless wandering, oblivious to the desperate humans making their dash for survival. Nixon reached the basement door to the house, reaching out and trying the knob, relieved to find it unlocked. He gently pushed it open while keeping his weapon at chest level, just in case. The door swung inward with a slight creak, revealing darkness beyond. He stood there for several moments, making sure nothing was coming his way. His eyes adjusted gradually to the dimness, allowing him to make out shapes in the gloom. Furniture, storage boxes, and something else he couldn't quite identify. After he was certain, he led them inside, gesturing for them to follow with a quick wave of his hand. The basement room was a battlefield, with blood coating most surfaces. The metallic scent hit them like a physical force, causing David to gag and bring his arm up to cover his nose. 2 bodies lay in the corner of the room, and at a quick glance revealed both of their heads caved in. Nixon moved over to the stairs, walking up 2 of them when the step creaked so loud it sent the sound resonating throughout the house. The noise seemed to hang in the air, a beacon advertising their presence to anything with ears. Immediately, moaning and rapid footsteps were set off upstairs. The shuffling of feet grew louder, heading directly for the stairwell. Nixon braced himself as a creature rushed down the stairs. As it turned the corner on the small landing, the zombie's eyes met with Nixon's, causing it to go into a frenzy. It rushed forward, missing the step and falling onto the shears and the man holding them. Despite his best effort, Nixon couldn't remain upright, being driven back onto the floor, landing hard on the ground, the air being forced from his lungs as the handles of the shears drove into his chest. Pain exploded through his ribcage as the creature's weight pressed the tool deeper into his sternum. Violet reacted quickly, spinning her hammer around and swinging it upward so that the claw portion would make contact. She caught the zombie in the eyes, one of the claws piercing straight through, not far enough to hit the brain, but far enough for her to gain a hold and secure the creature's head above her friend. "David!" Violet shouted, straining to hold the thrashing zombie. David sprang into action, swinging the bat and connecting with the back of the zombie's head, cracking the skull. The sound was sickening, like a melon splitting, the creature falling limp. Before he could swing again, another zombie came barreling down the stairs, moving so fast it was almost a blur. David spun around, swinging the bat and connecting with the zombie's knees, shattering both kneecaps with a sickening thud. The creature tried to take another step, its legs failing, causing it to slam down onto the ground near Nixon's feet. He narrowly avoided a bite by kicking at the ground while Violet pulled on his shirt, dragging him backwards and away from the snapping jaws. The creature reached out for him, fingers grasping at air mere inches from his ankle, but fell limp as David delivered a forceful blow to the back of its head. Brain matter and bone fragments splattered across the concrete floor, adding to the horrific scene around them. The 3 of them remained in a battle-ready position as the noise from upstairs continued. Instead of footsteps, however, the only thing they heard was moaning and banging, as if a lone creature was trapped behind a door. The rhythmic thumping suggested something was trying to get out, but was unable to navigate the simple mechanics of a doorknob. After several tense moments, they realized nothing else was coming for them, at least not yet. The immediate threat had been neutralized, though the ongoing sounds from above kept them on edge. David and Violet helped Nixon off the ground, who took a moment to regain his composure. He pressed a hand to his chest, wincing at the tenderness where the shears had been driven into him. "Are we good?" Nixon asked, his voice slightly strained from the pain. Violet and David nodded yes, though their expressions remained vigilant. "Good. Now let's find those truck keys and get the hell out of here." Chapter 7. Nixon, Violet, and David searched the beach house, going through every drawer, bag, and pocket of the corpses in search of the elusive keys to the truck. The living room had been ransacked, furniture overturned, and possessions scattered across the floor. "Anything?" David called from the kitchen, where he was methodically opening and closing drawers. "Nothing yet," Nixon replied, rifling through a pile of clothes near one of the bodies. He tried not to focus on the gruesome remains, the caved-in skull that had once been someone's face. Instead, he kept his mind on the task: find the keys, get the boat, escape. Violet moved through the dining area, checking a jacket hung over one of the chairs, then moving on to a small table by the door where people might normally toss their keys when coming home. Nothing. "These people had to get around somehow," she muttered, frustration mounting as minutes ticked by. The ongoing moan and thud of the trapped zombie somewhere in the back of the house set a macabre rhythm to their search, an ever-present reminder of the danger lurking just beyond the walls. Nixon glanced nervously at the hallway each time the sound grew louder, as if the creature might somehow break free at any moment. David finished with the kitchen and moved to a small desk in the corner, pulling open drawers and sifting through mail and miscellaneous papers. His movements were increasingly frantic, his earlier caution giving way to a desperate urgency. "They've got to be here somewhere," he said, more to himself than to the others. After several minutes, Violet noticed a small bag sitting in the corner of the living room, partially hidden beneath a fallen lamp. She approached cautiously, as if expecting something to jump out at her, then knelt and reached inside. Her fingers closed around a set of metal objects, and her heart leapt. "I think I have something here," Violet exclaimed, pulling out a set of keys. The keychain was adorned with a small fishing lure, the kind of personal touch that might have once prompted questions about the owner's hobbies and interests. Now, it was just a functional piece of metal that might save their lives. Violet rushed over to the patio door, looking down at the truck as she hit the lock button once. She held her breath, watching the vehicle in the driveway, and breathed a sigh of relief when the brake lights lit up, accompanied by the distant chirp of the alarm system acknowledging the command. "I found them," she announced triumphantly, holding up the keys like a trophy. David and Nixon joined her in the living room, relief evident on their faces. Nixon pulled out his cell phone and dialed, putting it on speaker so they could all hear. A few moments later, it rang, Grant answering from David and Rachel's house, where they'd left the others. "Give me some good news," Grant said, his voice tight with pain or anxiety, probably both. "We got the keys to the truck, so we're ready to move when you are," Nixon replied, unable to keep the excitement from his voice. "It's gonna take us a minute to get to the car," Grant said. In the background, they could hear movement, the sounds of the others preparing to leave their temporary refuge. "No worries, we could use a breather anyway," Nixon assured him, glancing at David and Violet, who both nodded in agreement. The adrenaline rush from their earlier encounter with the zombies was beginning to wear off, leaving them tired and shaky. "So what's the plan?" Grant asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. "That's a good question," Nixon admitted, then turned to their local guide. "David, do you know where a boat ramp is?" "I do. It's a couple miles from here, but it's a pretty easy drive and it's on this side of the highway," David replied confidently. As a local, his knowledge of the area had become their most valuable asset. "Good. The more we can stick to the back roads, the better," Nixon said. "Yeah, we just go to the end of the road, hang a left, and drive along the water until we get to the entrance," David explained, gesturing the route with his hands even though Grant couldn't see him. "Did you hear that, Grant?" Nixon asked, making sure their friend had caught the directions. Yeah, sounds easy enough. You lead the way and we'll follow, Grant suggested. Sounds good to me. Now get moving, Nixon said, anxious to be on their way before more zombies appeared. I'll give you a call when we're at the car, Grant promised before hanging up. Nixon hit end on the call, looking back to the others. The excitement of finding the keys had given them all a second wind, but they knew they weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. Are y'all ready for a day on the ocean? Nixon asked, trying to inject some levity into the situation. David nodded, managing a weak smile at the attempt at humor, but Violet didn't respond. Instead, she turned to the kitchen, walking over to it and opening up the refrigerator. The cool air hit her face as she scanned the contents, her face lighting up when she saw a large pack of bottled water. She grabbed it and tossed it onto the counter with a satisfying thud. We might want to stock up with what we can, she suggested, already opening cabinets in search of non-perishable food. I'll check the bedrooms, at least the unoccupied ones, David offered, eager to make himself useful. Nixon nodded as David walked back down the hallway, both of them tensing as they passed the door where the last remaining zombie in the house continued smacking its hands against the wood. The rhythmic thumping had become like white noise, but the proximity still set them on edge. Get it loaded up. I'll pack up what I can find, Nixon instructed, already moving toward a pantry door he'd spotted earlier. Violet nodded and grabbed the water, lugging it down to the boat. The pack was heavy, but the thought of being stranded on the water without drinking supplies was motivation enough to bear the weight. Nixon opened the pantry, relief washing over him at the sight of well-stocked shelves. Canned goods, snack foods, and a few boxes of cereal lined the walls. He grabbed a trash bag from under the sink and began filling it. David returned from the bedrooms carrying a first aid kit and several blankets, along with a small battery-powered radio. Found these in a closet, he said, already heading out to add them to their growing stockpile in the boat. Over the next few minutes, the trio pulled several bags of food and drinks into the boat. It wasn't much, but should get them through a couple of days on the water. They worked quickly and silently, each lost in their own thoughts about what might come next. Nixon's phone vibrated as he tossed in the last bag he had. He clicked it on, speaking softly as he was out in the open, aware that sound could attract unwanted attention. Are you guys ready? He asked, keeping his voice low. As ready as we're ever going to be, Grant replied, his voice tinny through the small speaker. I'm going to keep you on the line, let you know of trouble, Nixon said, tucking the phone between his ear and shoulder as he climbed into the driver's seat of the truck. That's good, because I don't think I'm going to be able to see much following that big-ass boat, Grant remarked, attempting humor despite their dire situation. Nixon chuckled as he motioned for the others to get into the truck. Violet tossed the keys to him before she and David climbed in. The interior was spacious and smelled of leather and fishing bait, the scent of the previous owner's passion embedded in the upholstery. Nixon fired up the truck, letting it idle for a moment. The powerful engine rumbled to life, vibrating through the seats and giving them a momentary sense of security. He adjusted the mirrors, looking down the street and noticing a couple of zombies running towards them, drawn to the engine noise like moths to a flame. He ignored them, feeling safe in the massive vehicle. The truck was a beast, high off the ground and built like a tank. If anything could get them safely to the boat ramp, this was it. All right, hang on to your butts because here we go, Nixon announced, both to his passengers and to Grant on the phone. Nixon put the truck into drive, pulling out onto the road. He gently pushed the gas pedal down, picking up speed at a slow rate. The weight of the boat behind them was significant, requiring careful handling to prevent the trailer from fishtailing. He looked ahead, spotting several blocks of neighborhood before him. The streets were eerily empty, except for the occasional zombie wandering between houses or shambling down sidewalks. Most seemed to be drawn to their vehicle as soon as they heard it, their vacant eyes locking onto the movement. A block up, two zombies emerged from between houses, running straight at them. Nixon kept the truck steady, the vehicle barely noticing when the ghouls bounced off the front grille. The impact was jarring nonetheless, causing Violet to grip the door handle tighter. Jesus, she muttered, watching one of the creatures tumble into a roadside ditch after impact. 2 more blocks up and hang a left, David instructed, pointing ahead to where the road curved. Nixon nodded, turning on his turn signal so that Grant could see. The habit was so ingrained that it didn't even occur to him how unnecessary it was in their current circumstances. "You know, I can hear you through the phone," Grant pointed out, amusement evident in his voice despite the tension. Nixon chuckled, momentarily forgetting that he had his phone active. "Well, I've seen you drive, so can you blame me for being cautious? I know you can't see my hands at the moment, but rest assured, I'm flipping you off," Grant retorted. Nixon chuckled as he approached the turn, making it gently, not wanting to risk tipping over the boat. The trailer swung wide but stayed in line, the weight of the vessel keeping it stable. As he got onto the main road heading north, he slowed down when he saw the mess up ahead, his laughter dying in his throat. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, the words barely audible. "What is it?" Grant asked. Nixon stared out ahead, spotting a swarm of 30 to 40 creatures swarming around an overturned car, blocking almost the entirety of the road. The mass of bodies shifted and surged like a grotesque organism, hands reaching and clawing at the vehicle's underside where someone might be trapped. The scene was like something from a nightmare, made all the more horrific by the bright morning sunlight illuminating every gruesome detail. "Just plow through them like you did with the others," David suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "That's a lot of bodies to roll over. I'm not worried about the truck, but they could tip over the trailer if they hit one of them just right," Nixon pointed out, already slowing the vehicle to a crawl. "So what do we do? Backtrack?" Violet asked, peering through the windshield at the mass of undead ahead. "The side streets through the neighborhood aren't that big, so it's going to be a tight fit," David warned, clearly not enthusiastic about trying to navigate the narrow residential roads with a boat in tow. "I got an idea," Grant's voice came through the phone, determination replacing his earlier levity. Before Nixon could ask what he meant, he watched as Grant pulled out from behind the truck, the sedan accelerating and coming alongside them. The car stopped right beside them, engine idling as the passenger door opened. Anna and Rachel jumped out and climbed up into the truck bed, confusion visible on the faces of everyone inside the truck. "What in the hell are you doing?" Nixon demanded, leaning out the window to look back at the women now secured in the truck bed. "I'm gonna clear the path for you. I should be able to knock enough of them out of the way so you can get through," Grant explained, his voice crackling through the phone speaker. "So what, you're gonna sacrifice yourself?" Nixon asked incredulously, unable to believe his friend would take such a risk. "Hell no. If I wreck this thing, I expect you to pick my ass up," Grant replied with forced bravado that didn't quite mask his fear. Nixon chuckled, more from nervous tension than actual amusement, prompting Grant to do the same. The hollow laughter was a poor disguise for the gravity of what they were about to attempt. "All right, let's do this before I change my mind," Grant said, his voice steadying with resolve. "I'm following you," Nixon promised, gripping the steering wheel tighter as he prepared to accelerate. Grant hit the gas, picking up speed quickly as Nixon did the same. The truck followed about 20 yards behind, accelerating more slowly due to the weight of the boat. Nixon watched as the car ahead sped down the street, hitting 60 before slamming into the side of the zombie mob. Bodies flew through the air as the car lost speed almost immediately, the collective weight of the zombie mob proving to be a formidable obstacle. Limbs and torsos bounced off the hood and roof, some getting caught under the wheels and causing the car to bump and lurch forward. Nixon kept pace, the front of the truck hitting the back of the car, propelling it forward like a battering ram. The impact jolted everyone in the truck cab, but Nixon kept his foot steady on the accelerator, pushing the car ahead through the mass of bodies. A few seconds later, they made it to the other side of the horde, however. Grant began to lose control of the car. The front end was mangled from the impacts, the steering clearly compromised. Nixon watched helplessly as his friend spun out, the car jumping the curb and slamming into a tree with a sickening crunch of metal. "Grant!" Anna screamed from the truck bed, pounding on the back window in panic. Nixon slowed the truck, looking in his rearview mirror and spotting a mass of ghouls running after them, the survivors of their vehicular assault now focused on fresh prey. The creatures moved with surprising speed, closing the distance between them and the crashed car in seconds. "Sunroof! Sunroof!" Nixon shouted, both into the phone and out the window, hoping Grant could hear him. Nixon moved the truck over to the side of the wrecked car, everybody looking down, hoping that Grant was conscious. The front end of the sedan was crumpled against the tree trunk, steam rising from the damaged radiator. For a terrible moment, there was no movement from within. A split second later, they let out a sigh of relief as the sunroof began to open, loud music pouring out of it. Grant had cranked the stereo to maximum volume, the pounding bass vibrating the very air around them. Grant climbed through, getting onto the roof as zombies swarmed around his car. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, but he was moving with purpose, his injured arm held close to his body as he balanced on the crushed roof. He jumped over to the bed of the truck, landing with a thud next to Anna and Rachel. "I'm in, go, go," he shouted, scrambling to secure himself as the zombies reached the car. Nixon hit the gas, speeding off down the street. The truck fishtailed slightly before straightening out, the boat trailer swinging wide but remaining upright as they accelerated away from the crash scene. In the back of the truck, Grant sat up, helped to a crouching position by Anna and Rachel, the three of them looking back to the wreck, confused as to why most of the zombies remained by the car rather than chasing the truck. "Why aren't they following us?" Rachel asked, her voice barely audible over the wind and engine noise. "I cranked the radio before jumping over, hoping that they liked noise. Looks like I was right," Grant explained, a hint of pride creeping into his voice despite his obvious pain. "Not bad, Grant, not bad at all," Anna said, genuine admiration in her tone as she examined the cut on his forehead. "It's not often I have a good idea, but I'm glad you were here to see it," Grant replied with a weak smile. Anna let out a laugh, patting her friend on the shoulder as the group continued on towards the boat ramp. Chapter 8. Nixon continued driving them towards the boat ramp even as the world quickly unraveled around them. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, maintaining a steady speed despite the chaos they witnessed with each passing block. Seemingly every building they passed by had zombies running around it, some chasing still living people, others trying to break in, presumably to get at a survivor trapped inside. A woman screamed from a second-story window as three creatures clawed at her front door. A man raced across a yard, two zombies in close pursuit, disappearing behind a fence before they could see his fate. Anna watched the horrific scenes unfold from the truck bed, her hand covering her mouth in shock. Beside her, Rachel sat in stunned silence, while Grant kept his eyes fixed ahead, flinching each time they passed another pocket of violence. "It's happening everywhere," Grant said, his voice barely audible over the wind and engine noise. Inside the cab, Violet scanned the streets, cataloging the devastation with a detached precision that masked her horror. "It's spreading faster than I thought possible." Nixon kept his focus on the road, though his eyes occasionally darted to the rearview mirror, checking on their friends in the truck bed. "We just need to get to the water, one problem at a time." Occasionally, a creature would head towards the truck, but they blew by them before they became a threat. A woman in a torn business suit lunged at them as they passed a gas station, her fingers grazing the side of the truck before she fell behind. A couple of teenagers, their clothes soaked with blood, sprinted from between houses but couldn't match the vehicle's speed. A few tense minutes later, and they spotted the turnoff in the distance. A small sign for public boat launch was barely visible through the morning haze. "Finally," Violet said, relief momentarily softening her tense expression. Nixon made the turn onto the driveway, making sure that the boat wasn't going to roll off the road. The trailer swung wide but stayed true as they navigated the narrow access road. Once he was sure he was good, he hit the gas, heading down the ramp. Trees lined either side of the road, momentarily blocking their view of what lay ahead. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed like they might escape without further incident. Everyone had their spirits high until the boat ramp came into view. The trees gave way to an open parking area that sloped down to the water, and what they saw made their hearts sink. "You've got to be shitting me," Violet muttered, her brief optimism evaporating instantly. The scene ahead was anything but ideal. A handful of vehicles were scattered in the parking lot, some with doors left open, others with windows smashed. Zombies roamed around them, drawn perhaps by some earlier commotion or simply wandering aimlessly in search of prey. But the bigger issue was the ramp itself, which had a couple of trucks sitting there, blocking access to the water, left by people who undoubtedly only cared about themselves and not anybody else who might follow. The vehicles had been abandoned at angles that made navigating around them impossible. "What the hell do we do now?" David asked, desperation creeping into his voice as he surveyed the blocked ramp. "We're going to have to fight our way through them and move one of the trucks," Nixon replied. "You want to fight those things?" David's eyes widened in disbelief. "I don't see another way," Nixon said grimly. Nixon slowed the truck to a stop at the edge of the parking area, out of sight of most of the zombies. He opened up the back window, talking loud enough so that Grant and the others could hear. "We got a situation," he announced, though it was clear they could already see the problem. "Yeah, I can see that. What do you want to do?" Grant asked, leaning in toward the window. "Somebody is going to have to keep those people's attention while someone else moves one of the trucks," Nixon explained, the outline of a plan already forming in his mind. "Yeah, I was afraid you were going to say that," Grant said, grimacing as he eyed the creatures roaming the parking lot. "I can move the truck," Violet volunteered, her expression resolute. "Damn it," Grant muttered, shaking his head. "What's wrong?" Violet asked, confused by his reaction. "You beat me to it," Grant admitted with a wry smile. Violet chuckled lightly before snapping back into the moment. The levity was brief, overwhelmed by the gravity of what they were about to attempt. "It looks like there's a dozen of those things out there, and that's just what I can see," Grant observed, his eyes methodically scanning the area. "I can help you distract them if you want," David offered, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. "David, no, it's too dangerous," Rachel protested immediately. "We don't have a choice. We need to get to the water," David insisted. Rachel reached her hand inside the truck cab, her man grabbing it, giving her a soft kiss on the top of her hand. The gesture was tender, a small moment of connection they both needed. "I'll follow your lead," David told Grant, his resolve strengthening. "Most of those things are on the left. There's a truck halfway down on the right, the blue one, do you see it?" Grant asked, pointing toward a truck that was parked alone in the lot. "Yeah, I see it. And the two things that are beside it too," David confirmed, eyeing the zombies that lingered near their target. "We can handle them," Grant said, with more confidence than he felt. Violet grabbed her hammer, passing it through the window to Grant, who nodded appreciatively. The weight of the tool felt reassuring in his hand. "Let's get a move on. We're not the only people with this idea, so it's only a matter of time before another truck pulls up, and God only knows how many of those things they'll bring with them," Nixon urged, keeping an eye on the road behind them. Grant and David nodded, both of them hopping out to the parking lot. The gravel crunched under their feet as they landed, causing them to wince at the noise. They stayed low while they ran, trying their best to minimize their footfalls. However, the collective moans of the zombies did a good job of drowning out their noise. The creatures wandered aimlessly through the lot, some fixated on the abandoned vehicles, others simply shuffling without direction. None had noticed the newcomers yet, but that wouldn't last long. Grant pointed to the creature on the right as they approached the truck, focusing on it while David ran to the one on the left. When they got within a few yards of the ghouls, the creatures took notice, running towards them with a sudden burst of speed that caught both men off guard. Grant delivered a forceful hammer strike to the forehead of his creature, cracking its skull in a single blow. The impact sent a shudder up his arm, but the zombie dropped instantly, a dark puddle spreading beneath its head. David opted for a two-step attack plan, swinging low with his baseball bat and taking out the zombie's legs. The wood connected with a sickening crack, the creature's knees buckling as it lost balance. The creature slammed face first onto the pavement, receiving a crack to the back of its skull before it could get back up. It fell lifeless with a single strike, David's bat now stained with blood and matter he tried not to identify. "Come on, let's get into the truck," Grant urged. Both men climbed up into the truck bed, and once situated, Grant used his hammer to smack on the top of the cab. The metallic cling echoed across the lot, drawing the attention of several zombies across the lot. Heads turned in unison, vacant eyes fixing on the source of the noise. "Yeah, come get some assholes," Grant shouted, continuing to pound the roof of the truck. His yelling, combined with the constant banging, drew most of the mob in their direction. Several ghouls began sprinting toward them, arms outstretched and mouths hanging open in mindless hunger. Nixon watched from behind the wheel of the truck as zombies raced towards his friend. The creatures swarmed around the parked vehicle, clawing at the sides and trying to climb up to reach the men. A few seconds later, and the coast to the ramp was clear. He hit the gas slightly, not wanting to make a lot of engine noise, hoping that Grant and David could keep the creatures occupied. The truck moved forward slowly, the boat trailer following obediently behind as they approached the ramp. Violet looked over to the duo, watching them swing at the creatures below, taking a couple out while avoiding their outstretched arms. David connected with another zombie's head, sending it tumbling back into its companions. Grant's hammer came down on grasping fingers that had almost reached the edge of the truck bed. "Get ready to move, Violet," Nixon said as they approached the blocked ramp. "I'm on it," she replied, her hand already on the door handle. Nixon hit the brakes, allowing Violet a chance to jump out. She moved with haste over to the two trucks blocking the ramp. The first truck door she tried was locked up tight, causing her to curse under her breath. Come on," she muttered, glancing back at the swarm of zombies around Grant and David. Their distraction was working, for now, but it wouldn't last forever. Violet rushed over to the other truck, pulling on the door, relieved when it opened. She jumped in, grabbing the keys that were left in the ignition, sparking the truck to life. The engine roared louder than she'd expected, making her wince. "Shit," she hissed, knowing the noise would draw attention. Violet quickly threw the truck into gear, pulling it away from the ramp, clearing the way for Nixon to back the boat into the water. She steered it to the side of the parking area, leaving it running as she jumped out and sprinted back toward Nixon's truck. Within seconds, the trio in the truck jumped out, disconnecting the boat from the trailer before jumping on board. Anna and Rachel helped pull the vessel away from the trailer as Nixon started the outboard motor. The engine sputtered momentarily before catching, a reassuring rumble that promised escape. Violet leapt from the truck, running towards the boat, with plenty of room to spare as the zombies were still focused on David and Grant, who finally noticed that it was time to go. "We're going to have to run for it," Grant said, eyeing the distance to the water. It wasn't far, but with the number of creatures surrounding them, it might as well have been miles. "I'm not sure I like that plan," David replied, swinging his bat at a zombie that had managed to get a handhold on the side of the truck. Grant swung his hammer again, missing a zombie's head, striking its shoulder. The miscalculation caused him to lose control of the hammer, dropping it to the ground with a clatter that was lost amid the moans of the undead. "We don't have a choice. You can stay here if you want, but I'm running," Grant stated, already moving toward the front of the truck. David swung his bat again, hitting a zombie on the head, dropping it. His instinct was to stand his ground and clear the zombies, but his hand was forced when he spotted another cluster of zombies running down the driveway. "Damn it, we have more company," David shouted, pointing toward the entrance where at least a dozen more creatures had appeared, drawn by the noise of their struggle. "Over the front, let's go," Grant yelled. David and Grant vaulted over the roof of the truck cab, sliding down the hood and onto the asphalt. The impact jarred their legs, but adrenaline kept them moving. Both men pumped their legs hard, trying to put distance between them and the zombies that quickly pursued them. The boat was so close now, floating just off the edge of the ramp where Nixon had backed it in. They could see the others waving them on urgently, could hear Rachel calling her husband's name. Grant outpaced David, getting a couple steps ahead of his counterpart. David knew the bat was slowing him down, so he threw it behind him, hoping it would trip up a creature. Instead, it fell harmlessly to the ground. "Damn it," David cursed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. One of the zombies closed the gap with David, reaching out and smacking at his arm as he pumped it. The touch was enough to break his momentum, causing David to stumble. That was all it took for the zombies to overtake him. The lead creature crashed into his back, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. Before he could regain his feet, more of them were upon him, their weight pinning him down. Grant didn't see it happen, but he heard David begin to scream, only to have it muffled by the swarm of creatures piling on top of him. The sound chilled him to the bone, but he didn't slow down, knowing there was nothing he could do. Rachel screamed in horror from the boat that was just ahead, Grant watching as she tried to climb down, only to be restrained by Anna and Violet. Her anguished cries tore through the air as she fought against the others, desperate to reach her husband, despite the futility of such an attempt. "David, no, please, David," she wailed, her voice breaking with grief. Grant raced into the water towards the boat that was floating just off the dock, splashing around before swimming out the few yards to it. The cold water shocked his system, but he pushed through, arms cutting through the surface as he closed the distance. Violet reached down, pulling him up just far enough so that he could grab onto the railing and pull himself up. Water streamed from his clothes as he collapsed onto the deck, gasping for breath. "He's on board! Go!" Violet shouted to Nixon, who stood at the controls, his face a mask of shock, as he witnessed David's fate. "No, we can't leave David behind," Rachel continued, crying and screaming as Nixon looked back to shore, seeing David completely underneath a horde of zombies. The man's struggles had already ceased, the creatures now tearing at his flesh with savage intensity. Nixon thought about saying something, but he couldn't find the words of comfort to say. What could you possibly say to someone who just watched their spouse being devoured alive? Nixon used the controls to back the boat away from the ramp, slowly moving them out into the bay, leaving the horrors of land behind. The engine's hum was nearly drowned out by Rachel's sobs as she finally collapsed against Anna, who held her tightly, her own tears flowing freely. Chapter 9. Nixon piloted the boat skillfully, keeping the speed low as there wasn't a threat. The water stretched out around them, peaceful and indifferent to the horror unfolding on land. He kept it moving, not sure of where they were going to go. The horizon offered no obvious destination, just more water and the distant shoreline where unknown dangers waited. Occasionally, he'd glance back at the boat ramp, now just a speck in the distance, the memory of David's final moments still fresh in his mind. He glanced down at the deck, watching Anna and Violet trying to console Rachel, who was a complete sobbing mess. Her wails had subsided into quiet whimpers, but her body still shook with each breath. Grant sat beside them for a moment, his own expression haunted by what they'd witnessed. After a while, he pulled himself up and walked up to the controls, his movements stiff from the exertion of their escape. "Are you all right, man?" Nixon asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not really," Grant replied, his voice hollow. "That's understandable," Nixon said, unsure what else to offer. What words could possibly make sense of what they'd just experienced? "You gotta know, man, if there was anything I could have done, I would have," Grant said, guilt evident in his tone as he looked back at Rachel's hunched form. "You don't have to explain it to me. I get it. But one day you might have to explain it to her," Nixon responded, his voice low, so that only Grant could hear. Nixon nodded down to Rachel, prompting Grant to look away. The weight of responsibility settled over Grant's features, adding to the burden of his injured arm, which had begun to throb again now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "So where the hell are we going?" Grant asked, eager to change the subject. "Your guess is as good as mine," Nixon admitted, scanning the horizon for any sign of, well, anything. A moment later, Grant spotted something on the horizon, a dark mass that seemed out of place against the blue expanse. "What in the hell is that?" Grant pointed to the north in the middle of the bay, where something large floated in the water. It was too distant to make out clearly, but definitely man-made. Nixon looked down at the controls and the shelves beside it, spotting a pair of binoculars. He grabbed them and looked to the north, a slight smile tugging at his lips as he recognized what he was seeing. "Check it out and tell me what you think," he said, passing the binoculars to Grant. Grant looked through them, spotting a collection of other boats, numbering around 20, that had pulled together into a large makeshift flotilla. Vessels of various sizes had been tied together, creating a floating community out on the water. He contemplated for a moment before nodding. "It's worth a shot. With any luck, maybe someone there will know what's going on." "Or someplace that we can go," Nixon added, already adjusting their course. Grant nodded in agreement as Nixon moved them towards the other boats. It took a few minutes for them to get there, slowing down as they approached the outer edge. The collection of vessels grew more impressive as they neared. Fishing boats, pleasure craft, and even a small yacht formed the makeshift colony. Two people stepped to the edge of the flotilla, waving at them and directing them where to go. A man and woman stood on the deck of a fishing boat, gesturing to an open spot where they could dock. Nixon followed the directions as best he could, pulling alongside and butting up against the other boat. A middle-aged man with weathered features and a salt and pepper beard tossed over a rope that Violet grabbed, wrapping it around the railing to secure their vessel. The man's skin was tanned from years on the water, his movements practiced and confident. "That should be good enough," "The name's Oliver," he introduced himself, his voice carrying a coastal accent. "I'm Violet, and we got a whole host of people over here," she replied, gesturing to the others on their boat. "Nice to meet you. Why don't you come on over?" Oliver invited, extending his hand to help them aboard. Violet nodded, grabbing the older man's hand and stepping over to his ship. The vessel was well maintained, suggesting Oliver took pride in his boat. A few seconds later, Anna and a distraught Rachel did the same thing, the three women now standing on Oliver's deck. They looked across the boat, spotting two men sitting underneath a canopy, both of them eyeing them suspiciously. The men were younger than Oliver, maybe in their 30s, with hard expressions that suggested they'd seen their share of trouble. Their appearance put them at unease, which Oliver noticed. "Don't pay them any mind, they're harmless. They've just been through a lot today," Oliver assured them, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. "Yeah, join the club," Violet replied dryly, the events of the day having worn down her patience for hostility. Violet nodded toward Rachel, who was still disassociating from reality. Anna put her arm around her, joining Violet in walking over towards the canopy to get out of the sun. The heat beat down on the water, reflecting off the surface and making the air shimmer around them. The three women nodded at the two men, who didn't greet them with anything other than a glare. Violet wanted to say something snarky, but she kept it to herself. Now wasn't the time to antagonize potential allies, no matter how unfriendly they seemed. A few moments later, both Nixon and Grant stepped off of their boat and onto the flotilla. As they greeted each other, Oliver looked down and took notice of Grant's bandage, which was bright crimson. The blood had soaked through the gauze, creating a stark contrast against his skin. "Are you all right there, son?" Oliver asked, concern evident in his voice. "Some of those things took a chunk out of me. If you got a fresh bandage, I could give it a good home," Grant replied, trying to downplay the severity with humor. Violet looked over to the two men across from her, one of the men's eyes going wide at the sound of Grant describing his injury. The man's posture changed instantly, tension radiating from him, as if he'd just recognized a mortal threat. In a flash, the man leapt to his feet, pulling a gun from the back of his belt, aiming it towards Grant. The sudden movement startled everyone, freezing them in place for a crucial second. "He's infected! He's infected!" the man shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Grant looked over, putting his hands up in a defensive position. Whoa, take it easy," he said, his eyes fixed on the barrel of the gun. Oliver tried to yell out for the man to calm down, but before he could open his mouth, the man pulled the trigger. The crack of the gunshot echoed across the water, shattering the relative calm that had settled over them. A single round flew downrange, striking Grant in the chest, dropping him to the deck, blood immediately soaking through his shirt. "Grant!" Nixon shouted, lunging toward his fallen friend. Violet raced up behind the man, jumping onto his back and smacking the gun out of his hand. The weapon skittered across the deck, coming to rest against the railing. "You son of a bitch!" Violet screamed, her arms locked around the man's neck. Violet began strangling the man, keeping him occupied as Nixon raced over to him, kicking him squarely in the junk, the blow causing the man to collapse onto the deck in pain. The shooter doubled over, a high-pitched whine escaping his lips as he curled into himself. Violet and Nixon pounced on him, holding him down as Anna and Rachel raced to their friend's side. Grant lay motionless, blood pooling beneath him as Anna pressed her hands to the wound, trying to stem the flow. Oliver yelled to the other man, who was stunned by what happened, his mouth hanging open in shock. "Go get help now," Oliver commanded, pointing toward the other boats. The man nodded, racing off to another boat, his footsteps pounding against the deck as he leapt from vessel to vessel. "What did you do? What did you do?" Violet demanded, her knee pressed into the shooter's back as she held him down. The man spoke through the pain, struggling to catch his breath from the kick. His words came out in gasps, but the desperation in his voice was unmistakable. "The bites turned people into those things. The bites turned people into those things. He was going to kill us all," he insisted, trying to twist his head to look at them. Violet and Nixon exchanged a worrying glance, their minds racing through everything they've seen today. The image of the gas station clerk's blood, the zombies pursuing them through town, the creatures at the party house. Could it be true? Could the bites really transform people? In unison, they turned back to Rachel and Anna, who were by Grant's side, trying in vain to stop the bleeding. Anna's hands were covered in blood as she pressed against the chest wound, her expression determined despite the futility of her efforts. "Get away from him," Nixon shouted, suddenly realizing the danger. Rachel looked back to Nixon, hearing his words and doing as instructed. However, Anna kept the pressure on the wound, which was futile as his breathing had already stopped. Grant's chest no longer rose and fell, his eyes staring vacantly at the sky above. "Anna, get away from him," Violet called out, her voice urgent. Anna looked back towards Nixon, ready to give him a piece of her mind. Her face was flushed with anger, lips parted to deliver a rebuke. Before she could, however, Grant reanimated, sitting up just far enough to grab onto Anna and pull her closer to his mouth. The movement was unnaturally quick, Grant's eyes now vacant yet somehow focused as he lunged for Anna's exposed neck. She didn't get a chance to scream as her zombified friend wrapped its teeth around her neck. Blood poured from the wound as the flesh was removed, the sound of tearing meat audible even over Rachel's renewed screams. "Anna!" Violet cried out, helpless to intervene in time. Rachel screamed as she crawled backwards on the deck, yanked to her feet by Oliver as he raced by. The older man's face had gone pale, his earlier hospitality replaced by primal fear. I told you," the shooter yelled from his position on the deck, vindication providing no comfort as the situation deteriorated around them. Nixon looked over to the zombified Grant, who was getting to his feet. Anna's body lay beneath him, her neck torn open, blood spreading across the deck in a widening pool. Grant's movements were jerky yet purposeful, his head swiveling toward the living as he sensed fresh prey. "Get to another boat," Nixon commanded, backing away from the advancing threat. Oliver continued pulling Rachel away from the scene as Violet joined them. Before she left, however, Violet delivered another forceful kick to the shooter's sensitive area, causing him to pull up into the fetal position. Nixon tried to grab the gun off the deck but abandoned it when Grant closed the distance to him quickly. The creature that had once been his friend moved with frightening speed, hands outstretched and teeth bared. Nixon dove back, narrowly avoiding being grabbed, but leaving the shooter open for attack. The man's eyes widened in terror as he realized what was about to happen. No, please," he begged, trying to scramble away despite his pain. The man let out a pained scream as Grant pounced on top of him, ripping at his flesh with ferocity. Blood sprayed as Grant tore into the man's neck, silencing his screams with horrific efficiency. Nixon left him behind, running up to the others who had already made it to the next boat in the flotilla. Oliver was helping Rachel aboard, while Violet stood ready to assist Nixon. "We have to move. Go." Chapter 10. Oliver quickly began undoing the ropes that were holding the outer boats together with the flotilla. His weathered hands worked with practiced efficiency, pulling at knots that had been tied to keep the makeshift community together. The urgency of the situation was evident in his movements, quick, precise, but tinged with panic. Violet immediately caught on with what he was doing, joining him in undoing it. She yanked at the thick ropes, her fingers burning from the friction as she worked to create distance between them and the nightmare unfolding on the other boat. "Hurry," she urged, glancing back to see the feeding frenzy continuing where they'd left the shooter. Nixon, meanwhile, looked around for a makeshift weapon, eventually noticing a long pole along the side of the deck. It was a boat hook, about 6 feet in length with a metal tip. Not ideal for combat, but better than nothing. He grabbed it, readying it for the zombies that would surely come. He didn't have to wait long as a zombified Anna emerged from the other side of the boat, locking onto them and racing towards the other boat. Her movements were jerky yet purposeful, blood still dripping from her ravaged neck as she fixed her vacant gaze on the living. The transformation had been horrifyingly quick. Only minutes ago she'd been trying to save Grant, and now she was just like him. "Anna," Nixon whispered, grief momentarily overriding his survival instinct. Nixon pushed the pole out, slamming it into Anna's chest with enough force to knock her off balance. The creature stumbled to the deck, quickly scrambling back to its feet. The boat hook had barely slowed her down, serving only to redirect her momentum temporarily. "Help me push the boat away," Oliver shouted, his voice strained with effort as he leaned his weight against the separating vessels. Violet and Rachel helped him push, while Nixon did his best to keep Anna occupied with the pole. The boats began to drift apart, the gap between them widening inch by agonizing inch. Once the boat was a few feet away, he used the pole to push it further away, extending it across the water to create more distance. The zombified Anna continued pursuing them, rushing up to the railing with such force that she toppled over the side, splashing into the cold water below. The splash was followed by silence. No thrashing, no attempt to swim, just the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. Everybody breathed heavily, struggling to comprehend what just took place. Nixon leaned against the railing, pole still clutched in his white-knuckled grip as he stared at the water where Anna had disappeared. Rachel had collapsed onto a bench, her eyes vacant, mind still processing the trauma of losing David, and now witnessing the horror of Grant and Anna. After a few moments, Violet's anger got the better of her, grabbing Oliver and yelling, her hands twisted in his shirt as she pushed him against the cabin wall. "What in the hell was that? Why didn't you warn us?" she demanded, her face inches from his. Oliver put his hands up in a defensive position, trying to de-escalate the situation. His eyes were wide with genuine fear, not just of Violet's rage, but of the situation that had spiraled so quickly out of control. "I didn't know he was going to do that, I swear," he insisted, voice cracking with stress. "Bullshit," Violet spat back, tightening her grip on his shirt. "I don't even know who he was. He just came over half an hour ago and just sat there. I thought he needed a break from everything, which I understood," Oliver explained, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. Violet continued staring at him, suspicion and fury warring in her eyes. Eventually, she let go when Nixon put his hands on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. "It's okay, Violet, it's okay," Nixon said softly, though there was nothing okay about any of this. Despite the rage still coursing through her, she stepped away, pacing the deck like a caged animal. Her footsteps were heavy on the wooden planks, her breathing ragged as she tried to contain the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I'm sorry about your friends, I really am," Oliver offered, straightening his shirt and keeping a cautious distance. "I know, it might be best if you stay quiet for a moment," Nixon advised, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Violet stopped pacing, turning to face the others. "I don't want to stay here," she declared, her voice steady despite the turmoil evident in her expression. "I don't know how we're getting back to the boat," Nixon pointed out, gesturing to their vessel now floating abandoned several yards away. "I don't care. I don't want to stay here," Violet insisted, crossing her arms as if physically holding herself together. "You could always take that guy's boat," Oliver suggested after a moment of uncomfortable silence. Both Violet and Nixon looked over to Oliver with a curious look, suspicion immediately flaring in their eyes. "If you didn't know him, how do you know he has a boat?" Violet asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Oliver let out a deep sigh, shaking his head, knowing he'd just exposed his lie. The deception was written clearly across his weathered features as he realized his mistake. "It was a friend of mine, but I honestly had no idea he was capable of that," he admitted, not meeting their accusatory stares. Violet became enraged, stepping toward Oliver with renewed fury, but Nixon stepped in between them, keeping the tensions low. He placed a restraining hand on Violet's shoulder, using his body as a physical barrier. "Where's his boat?" Nixon asked, keeping his focus on the practical solution rather than Oliver's dishonesty. "A couple boats over, I'll show you," Oliver replied, visibly relieved at the change in direction. "What about them?" Violet asked, pointing to the other two boats that were floating 10 yards away and slowly drifting apart. On the deck, the zombified Grant stood side by side with the zombie remains of his killer, both of them staring at the others on the deck, hunger in their dead eyes. Grant's shirt was soaked with blood, both his own and that of the shooter he'd attacked. The sight of her friends transformed into these monsters made Violet's stomach turn. "It doesn't sound like the smartest idea to just let them float around out there," Nixon observed, imagining the creatures washing up on shore somewhere, continuing the spread of whatever this was. Oliver let out a sigh, not knowing what to do. The answer to their problem was given to him as Rachel emerged from the nearby control room, carrying a bottle of whiskey with a towel shoved into the top. Her movements were purposeful, her earlier catatonia replaced by a cold determination. "If somebody gives me a light, I can take care of it," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. The other three stared at her for a moment in disbelief, but quickly realized she was right. There was no saving them now, and leaving them to drift was too dangerous. "I hate to give up that boat," Oliver lamented. "You can fight for it if you want to, but that seems dangerous," Violet replied, her tone making it clear what she thought of that idea. Oliver let out a sigh before pulling out a lighter. He lit the Molotov fuse, allowing Rachel to throw it over. The four of them watched as it flew through the air, breaking on the deck of the boat with a crash of glass and a whoosh of igniting alcohol. A few moments passed as the flames spread, quickly engulfing the two zombies on the deck, who didn't react to the flames. They continued to stand there, seemingly unaware as the fire consumed them. A few minutes later, and the entire deck was engulfed in an inferno, black smoke billowing up into the clear sky. Rachel watched without emotion, her face illuminated by the distant flames. There was nothing left of the woman who had been sobbing over her husband just an hour ago. Grief had hollowed her out, leaving only a shell behind. "Show us where that boat is," Violet demanded, turning away from the burning vessel. Oliver nodded and led them through several other boats connected to the flotilla. As they walked, the trio saw a couple dozen people, huddled together and struggling to understand what was happening. Fear was etched on every face they passed, young and old alike gripped by the uncertainty of their situation. A few of them tried to talk, but Oliver put his hand up, silently telling them that he'd explain. The gesture was practiced, suggesting he had assumed some sort of leadership role among the survivors. Within minutes, they were at the other boat, which was smaller than the one they rode in on. It was a 20-foot center console fishing boat, weathered but well-maintained. The outboard motor looked reliable, and there was enough room for the three of them to travel comfortably. "It's not much, but it'll get you to where you need to go," Oliver said, gesturing to the vessel. "If only we knew where that was," Nixon replied, surveying the boat with a critical eye. "If you head south a few miles past the bridge, you'll find the inlet that will take you out to the ocean," Oliver explained, pointing toward the distant shoreline. "That's good enough for me. Come on, let's get moving," Nixon decided, eager to put distance between themselves and this place of death. Nixon and Violet stepped over to the boat, turning around for Rachel, who stood beside Oliver. There was something different about her posture, a reluctance evident in how she held herself back from joining them. "Rachel, are you coming?" Violet asked, extending her hand toward the grieving woman. She thought about it for a moment before shaking her head, her decision clearly already made. "David and I were just fine before you showed up, and now he's gone," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the accusation underlying her words. "Rachel," Violet began, hurt evident in her tone. She held up her hand, getting her to stop talking. The gesture was firm but not angry, just resolute, the decision of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I know it's not your fault, but I can't look at either of you without blaming you. I need to stay here," Rachel explained, her honesty brutal but understandable. Both Violet and Nixon nodded at her, neither knowing what to say to her grief. What words could possibly bridge the gap between them now? What comfort could they offer when she was right? Their arrival had set in motion the chain of events that led to David's death. "There should be a radio on there. I'll keep it tuned to Channel 3 if you need to reach out," Oliver offered, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Nixon and Violet nodded as they undid the lines connecting them, pushing off and putting some distance on them. The boat rocked gently as they moved away from the flotilla, the community of survivors growing smaller behind them. Nixon got behind the controls, starting up the boat and heading south. The engine caught on the first try, its steady rumble providing a background to their somber departure. Neither of them looked back as they pulled away, leaving behind one more friend in a day that had already cost them too many. Violet pulled out her phone, calling Dawn. The connection was surprisingly good out on the water, the call connecting after just 2 rings. "Violet, are you safe?" Dawn's voice came through clearly, concern evident in her tone. "Nixon and I are," Violet replied. Violet let her words hang in the air for a moment, Dawn fully understanding the implication of them before shedding a few silent tears. Rather than push the issue, she changed the subject, recognizing that now wasn't the time for details. "Where are you headed?" Dawn asked, her voice slightly thick with emotion she was trying to control. "We're headed to the inlet to get to the ocean. I figured we'd work our way back towards the beach house in case you and your new friend need an escape," Violet explained, leaning against the side of the boat as Nixon navigated. "With as much company as we have, I don't know if that's an option," Dawn admitted. "Still, we'll be there if you need us." "We don't really have any place else to be," Violet assured her, needing to feel like they had some purpose, some direction in this new, horrifying world. "Be safe out there," Dawn urged, her voice softening with genuine concern. "We'll try. I'll let you know when we're close," Violet promised. Violet ended the call, stepping over to Nixon, both of them looking out over the water. The sun was high in the sky now, casting a glittering path across the bay's surface. They stayed silent until they spotted the large bridge in the distance. The structure spanned the water, connecting the mainland to the islands beyond. "Jesus Christ," Violet breathed, the words escaping her involuntarily. On the bridge sat a massive pileup that blocked both directions. Cars had crashed into each other, creating a tangled web of metal that completely halted any traffic flow. Even from distance, they could see lots of foot traffic on the bridge, clearly zombies. The creatures moved across the structure, some clustered around vehicles where occupants might still be trapped, others wandering aimlessly along the lanes. Occasionally, they could see figures running, survivors pursued by the faster ghouls. Neither Violet or Nixon had the words to respond to the horrific visuals, instead staying silent as they continued on out to the ocean, hoping that the open water would provide them with some sense of comfort. Nixon guided the boat under the bridge, keeping well clear of the structure. They could hear distant screams from above, the sounds of a world coming apart at the seams. Violet stared straight ahead, refusing to look up at the carnage above them. As they cleared the bridge, the inlet lay ahead, leading out to the open ocean. The water grew choppier as they approached, the gentle waves of the bay giving way to the stronger currents where the bodies of water met. "You ready for this?" Nixon asked, glancing at Violet as he adjusted their course. "No," she replied honestly, "but what choice do we have?" Nixon nodded, understanding perfectly what she meant. There was no going back. Not to the flotilla, not to land, and certainly not to the lives they'd known just that morning. All they could do was move forward, into uncertain waters and an even more uncertain future. The end.